The night of the withered veil. The withered veil stretched across the northern marches like a shroud torn by time, a land where the earth cracked beneath a sky of perpetual ash, and the rivers ran thin with silt and sorrow. Once, it had been a realm of green valleys and golden fields, its banners fluttering under the sun, but war and ruin had bled it dry, leaving only dust and the husks of villages swallowed by the wind. Through this desolation rode Sir Aldrich, a knight whose armor hung loose on his frame, its plates dulled by grime and scratched by blades long since broken. His steed, a gray mare named Mistral, plodded beneath him, her hooves kicking up clouds of ash that settled on his cloak, a tattered remnant of blue, its edges frayed like the memory of the oaths he'd sworn. Aldrich's helm rested in his lap, its visor dented, revealing a face etched with exhaustion lines carved by years of sleepless nights, a beard matted with sweat and dirt, eyes the color of storm-washed slate, dimmed by too many farewells. His sword hung at his side, its scabbard chipped, the blade within notched from battles he could no longer count. He'd been a knight of the Order of the Saffron Crown, sworn to protect a kingdom that no longer stood, its halls crumbled, its king buried beneath a cairn of stones he'd helped pile. The war had ended not with victory, but with silence, and Aldrich rode on, driven by a promise he'd made to a dying friend, a vow to find the last remnant of their order, the saffron chalice, a relic said to hold the light of hope. The wind keened through the vale, a mournful song that stirred the ash into eddies around Mistral's legs, and Aldrich pulled his cloak tighter, the cold seeping through his mail. The horizon was a blur of gray, broken only by the skeletal remains of trees and the occasional spire of a tower fallen to ruin. He'd heard tales of the chalice whispered by campfires, scratched into the walls of abandoned keeps that it lay hidden in the vale, guarded by the ghosts of those who'd failed to claim it. His hands, gloved in cracked leather, gripped the reins, and he urged Mistral forward, her ears twitching at the sound of his voice, rough and low. "One more mile, girl," he murmured, "then we rest." Dusk fell slow and heavy, the ash-laden sky dimming to a bruised purple, when a light pierced the gloom, a faint golden glow flickering through the haze, steady as a heartbeat. Aldrich reined Mistral to a halt, squinting into the wind, his hand drifting to his sword. It wasn't a fire, nor a lantern carried by some lost soul, but something older, deeper, pulsing from the earth itself. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the ash, and led Mistral toward it, the mare snorting softly as the glow grew brighter, illuminating a hollow in the cracked ground. At its center stood a shrine, or what remained of it, its stones weathered to stubs, its roof long gone, replaced by a canopy of twisted branches that arched overhead like a cage. The light came from within, a soft radiance spilling from a chalice set on a slab of marble, its surface wrought in gold and saffron, etched with runes that shimmered faintly. The saffron chalice, unmarred by the veil's decay, glowed with a warmth that cut through the cold, its presence a whisper of the kingdom Aldrich had lost. He approached, his armor clanking faintly, and knelt before it, the ash dusting his knees, his breath catching in his throat. "You've come far, Sir Aldrich," a voice said, thin and dry as the wind, rising from the shadows beyond the shrine. He turned, his sword half drawn, to see a figure step into the light, a woman, or the semblance of one, her form gaunt and translucent, her robes a faded echo of saffron and white. Her eyes were hollow, her hair a cascade of gray that drifted as if underwater, and she carried a staff of blackened wood, its tip glowing with the same golden light as the chalice. "I am Lysara," she said, her voice a sigh, "last of the saffron keepers. This is what you seek, isn't it?" Aldrich rose, his sword still in hand. though his arm trembled with fatigue. "I swore to find it," he said, his tone rough but steady, "for Gavrin, who died with its name on his lips. He said it could bring back what we lost, the light, the hope. Is it true?" Lysara drifted closer, her form flickering in the chalice's glow, and tilted her head, her hollow eyes fixed on him. "It holds what was," she murmured. "The saffron crown's grace, its courage, its dreams, but it cannot rebuild what's gone, only show it, for a moment, to those who bear its weight. Touch it, night, and see. But know this, the veil claims all who linger." Aldrich sheathed his sword, his hands shaking as he reached for the chalice. Its metal was warm, alive with a pulse that matched his own, and as his fingers closed around it, the world shifted. The ash fell away, the veil dissolving into a vision of golden fields, towers of white stone gleaming under a sun unclouded by war, knights in saffron cloaks laughing by a river that sparkled with life. Gavrin stood among them, his face unscarred, his voice calling Aldrich's name with a joy he'd forgotten. It was fleeting, a breath of what had been, and then it faded, the ash returning, the cold biting at his skin. He set the chalice back on the slab, his chest tight, his eyes burning with unshed tears. "It's enough," he whispered, more to himself than Lysara, "to see it once." The keeper nodded, her form dimming. "Then take its light," she said, and pressed her staff to the chalice, drawing a thread of gold that coiled into a small orb, no bigger than a coin. She offered it to him, and he took it, its warmth seeping through his glove. "Carry it, Sir Aldrich. The veil is yours. Now I am free." Lysara vanished, her staff clattering to the ground, and the chalice's glow softened, its runes fading to silence. Aldrich stood alone, the orb pulsing in his hand, Mistral nickering softly behind him. The withered veil stretched vast and empty around him, but the light in his palm was a spark, a memory, a promise, and for the first time in years, the knight felt the road ahead lighten, if only a little. The golden orb in Aldrich's hand radiated a faint warmth, seeping through the cracks of his tattered gloves, as if whispering to him with each fragile pulse. He carefully tucked it into a small leather pouch at his side, securing the drawstring tightly to keep it safe amidst the desolation. Mistral snorted, her ears drooping, sensing the shift in the air, a strange stillness that settled after Lysara's departure, as if the withered veil itself were holding its breath, waiting. Aldrich mounted his steed, the creak of his armor blending with the wind's low moan. The shrine behind him stood silent now, the saffron chalice dimmed to a mere glint of metal, its runes extinguished. The orb in his pouch was all that remained of its light, a fragile ember of the past, a burden and a gift. He patted Mistral's neck, murmuring, "We move on, girl. There's more to this road yet." The mare nickered in response, her hooves stirring the ash as they set off into the gray expanse. The veil stretched endless before him, its cracked earth and skeletal trees a relentless reminder of what had been lost. Yet the orb's warmth against his hip was a quiet companion, urging him forward. He had no map, no clear destination, only the vow to Gavrin, and the flicker of hope that the light he carried might mean something beyond a fleeting vision. Hours passed, the sky deepening to a bruised indigo, when Mistral's ears pricked up, her pace faltering. Aldrich tightened his grip on the reins, his eyes scanning the horizon. A sound cut through the silence, not the wind's mournful wail, but a sharp, rhythmic clatter, like metal striking stone. He drew his sword, its notched blade catching the last threads of dusk, and urged Mistral toward the noise. The ash thinned as they crested a low rise, revealing a ravine below, its jagged walls framing a grim scene. A caravan, or what was left of it, lay scattered across the ground, overturned wagons, their wooden frames splintered, barrels and crates spilling into the dust. Among the wreckage stood a handful of figures, clad in mismatched armor and cloaks patched with hides, their blades glinting as they circled a lone survivor. The survivor was a young woman, her dark hair tangled and streaked with ash, her stance defiant, despite the blood trickling from a gash on her arm. She wielded a short spear, its tip trembling but held firm, her eyes darting between her attackers, 5 of them, raiders by the look of their scarred faces and crude weapons. Aldrich's jaw tightened. The withered veil bred such scavengers, men and women who'd forsaken honor for survival, preying on the lost and the desperate. He spurred Mistral forward, the mare charging down the slope with a force that sent ash billowing in their wake. The raiders turned, startled, as Aldrich's voice rang out, hoarse but commanding, "Stand down, or die where you stand." His sword gleamed faintly in the orb's reflected light, a shadow of the knight he'd once been. The raiders hesitated, then one, a burly man with a notched axe, sneered and lunged. Aldrich parried the blow, the clash of steel echoing through the ravine, and drove his blade into the man's shoulder. The raider fell with a grunt, clutching the wound, and the others faltered, their bravado crumbling. "Take your wounded and go," Aldrich said, his tone cold as the wind. "I've no patience for carrion." The remaining raiders exchanged glances, then dragged their companion away, disappearing into the haze. Aldrich sheathed his sword, his breath heavy, and turned to the woman. She lowered her spear, though her grip remained tight, her eyes wary. "You're no scavenger," she said, her voice steady despite the strain. "Who are you?" "Sir Aldrich, once of the Saffron Crown," he replied, dismounting. "Now just a man on a road." "And you?" "Ellen," she said, brushing ash from her sleeve. "Trader's daughter until this." She gestured to the wreckage, her expression hardening. "They took everything. Food, coin, my father's maps. Left me to rot." Aldrich glanced at the ruined caravan, then back to her. "You're alive. That's more than most get in the Vale. Where were you headed?" "North," she said, nodding toward the distant spires barely visible through the gloom. "To the Black Hollow. There's a settlement there, or was. My father thought we could barter for supplies, start over. He didn't make it." A pang stirred in Aldrich's chest, the echo of his own losses, but he pushed it aside. The Hollow's a hard ride. Raiders aren't the worst of what prowls these lands. You'll need more than a spear. Elend's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile. "I've lasted this long, but I won't say no to company if you're going that way." Aldrich studied her for a moment, weighing the risk. The orb pulsed faintly at his side, its warmth a quiet nudge. He nodded. "Gather what you can salvage. We ride at first light." As Elend rummaged through the wreckage, Aldrich led Mistral to a sheltered nook in the ravine, his mind turning. The Black Hollow was a name he'd heard before whispered in the Order's halls, as a place where the Vale's corruption ran deepest, where shadows moved with purpose. If the chalice's light had a purpose beyond memory, perhaps it lay there. For now, he'd keep the orb's secret close, a spark to guide him through the ash. Night fell, and the wind sang its dirge. Aldrich sat by a small fire Elend had coaxed from scavenged wood, the golden orb hidden but alive in his pouch. The road ahead loomed darker than ever, but for the first time in years, he wasn't riding it alone. The golden orb pulsed softly against Aldrich's side, its warmth a quiet anchor as he watched Elend sift through the wreckage of her caravan. She moved with a practiced efficiency, salvaging what little remained: a cracked water skin, a bundle of dried herbs, a dagger with a chipped hilt, her hand steady despite the blood still seeping from the gash on her arm. The fire she'd kindled flickered weakly, casting shadows across her face, and Aldrich caught glimpses of something beyond the defiance she wore, a weariness that mirrored his own, etched into the lines around her eyes. Though she couldn't be more than 20 winters old. He shifted. the clank of his armor breaking the silence. "You said you're a trader's daughter," he began, his voice low but probing. "Yet you fight like someone who's seen more than market squabbles. Where'd you learn to hold a spear like that?" Elin paused, her fingers tightening around the dagger before she tucked it into her belt. She didn't meet his gaze, staring instead into the flames. "My father wasn't just a trader," she said finally, her tone clipped. "He was a cartographer, mapped the old routes through the Vale before it turned to ash. Back when there were still villages to trade with, before the war ate them all. He taught me to survive, said a map's no good if you can't live to follow it." Aldrich nodded, sensing the weight behind her words. "And your mother?" "Dead," Yellen replied, her voice flattening. "Years ago, when I was a girl. The ash plague took her same as half the Hollows folk. Father said it came with the first storms. After the saffron crown fell, the air turned sour and people just withered. She lasted a week, coughing black until there was nothing left." She rubbed her arm absently, smearing the blood. "After that, it was just me and him, mapping, trading, running from what crept out of the ruins." Aldrich's chest tightened at the mention of the plague, a scourge he'd seen in the war's final days, when the kingdom's collapse unleashed more than just steel and fire. "The Hollow's a cursed place," he said. "Even the Order avoided it. What drove your father back there?" Ellen pulled a folded parchment from a satchel she'd salvaged, its edges singed but intact. She unfolded it carefully, revealing a map scratched in faded ink rivers and roads long erased by the Vale, and at its northern edge, a circled mark labeled Black Hollow. "This," she said, tapping the circle. "He found something last season in an old shrine west of here. A tablet, carved with runes he couldn't read, but he swore it pointed to the Hollow, said. There was a vault beneath it, older than the crown, holding the heart of the Vale. He thought it was wealth, maybe relics to trade. I think it was something else." Aldrich leaned closer, the firelight glinting off his dented helm as he studied the map. "The heart of the Vale," he murmured, his mind drifting to the orb in his pouch. Lysara's words echoed. The Vale claims all who linger, and he wondered if Elin's father had stumbled onto the same thread of light he now carried. "And the raiders? They wanted this?" "Partly," Elin said, folding the map with a grimace. "They took his notes, the tablet too. But they weren't just scavengers. One of them, he had a mark on his neck, a spiral burned into the skin. I've seen it before, on corpses we found near the Hollow. Father called them the Hollow Men, said they serve something in the dark, something that's been waking up." Before Aldrich could press further, Mistral whinnied sharply, her head jerking toward the ravine's edge. The wind had shifted, carrying a new sound, a low, guttural rumble, like stone grinding against stone, punctuated by a hiss that prickled the hairs on Aldrich's neck. He rose, sword in hand, the notched blade catching the fire's glow. "Get behind me," he ordered Elin, who snatched her spear and obeyed, her eyes scanning the shadows. From the haze above the ravine emerged shapes, hulking, misshapen figures, their outlines blurred by the ash. 3 of them, each twice a man's height, lumbered into view, their bodies a grotesque meld of flesh and stone. Jagged plates of rock jutted from their backs, their arms ending in claws that scraped the earth, and their faces where faces should have been were featureless slabs, save for glowing fissures that pulsed red, like molten veins. Ash wraiths, the Order had called them creatures born from the Vale's corruption, remnants of men or beasts, twisted by its decay. Aldrich cursed under his breath. "Stay close," he growled, stepping forward as Mistral reared, her hooves pawing the air. The nearest wraith lunged, its claw slashing downward, and Aldrich rolled aside, the impact shattering the ground where he'd stood. He swung his sword, the blade biting into the creature's arm. Steel met stone with a screech, sparks flying, but the wraith barely flinched, its glowing fissures flaring brighter. Elin darted in, thrusting her spear at the second wraith's side. The tip sank into a patch of flesh between the rock plates, drawing a hiss of black vapor, and the creature staggered, swiping at her with a claw. She ducked, but the third wraith closed in, its rumble shaking the earth. Aldrich pivoted, driving his sword into its leg, the blade lodging deep. The wraith howled a sound like cracking ice and lashed out, catching his shoulder with a glancing blow that sent him sprawling into the ash. Pain flared through his arm, but he gritted his teeth, scrambling up as Elin shouted, "The fire, use it!" She grabbed a burning branch and hurled it at the wounded wraith. The flames licked its flesh and it recoiled, shrieking as the vapor ignited in a burst of sickly green. Aldrich seized the chance, yanking a torch from the fire and thrusting it into the face of the wraith he'd struck. The red fissures dimmed, the creature thrashing as flames ate into it, and with a final groan, it collapsed into a heap of smoldering stone. The third wraith hesitated, then retreated into the haze, its rumble fading. Aldrich slumped against Mistral, panting, his shoulder throbbing. Elin dropped her spear, her hands shaking as she wiped ash from her face. "What were those things?" she rasped. "Ash wraiths," Aldrich said, sheathing his sword with a wince. "The veils spawn. They hunt the living drawn to warmth, to light." His hand brushed the pouch, the orb's pulse quickening, and a chill ran through him. Had it called them here? Elin retrieved her map, her expression grim. "If the hollow's worse than this, we're dead before we get there." "Then we move fast," Aldrich said, mounting Mistral despite the ache in his bones. "Daylight's our best chance. The wraiths shun it." He offered her a hand, pulling her up behind him. "Your father's vault, whatever it holds, it's tied to this place. We find it, we might find answers." As they rode into the night, the wind carried faint echoes, more rumbles, distant cries, the veil stirring with threats unseen. The orb glowed faintly through its pouch, a beacon or a curse, and Aldrich felt the weight of it grow. Ahead lay the black hollow, its shadows deepening, and behind them the ash whispered of more horrors to come. The night stretched long and cold, the withered veil a vast shroud, pierced only by the faint glow of the orb at Aldrich's side. Mistral's hooves churned the ash in a steady rhythm, her breath fogging in the chill as she carried her two riders northward. Elin clung to Aldrich's back, her arms tight around his waist, her spear lashed to the saddle beside her salvaged satchel. The map, creased and singed, rested in her grip, its edges fluttering in the wind. Neither spoke, the silence between them heavy with the echoes of the ash wraith's shrieks and the unspoken questions that gnawed at their minds. Dawn crept in reluctantly, a thin smear of gray leaching into the sky, offering no warmth, but enough light to dull the veil's oppressive gloom. Aldrich reined Mistral to a halt, atop a crumbling ridge, the mare snorting as she pawed the ground. Below stretched a winding scar through the ash, a road, or what remained of one, its cobblestones cracked and half-buried, snaking toward the jagged silhouette of the black hollow. Spires of twisted rock jutted from the horizon, their bases swallowed by a haze that shimmered faintly, like heat rising from a furnace. Elin slid from the saddle, unfolding the map against Mistral's flank. "That's it," she said, her voice rough from exhaustion. "The hollow road. Father said it was the last path merchants took before the storms came. We're close half a day, maybe less." Aldrich dismounted, his boots sinking into the ash as he scanned the terrain. "Too quiet," he muttered, his hand resting on his sword. "The wraiths don't hunt by day, but something's watching." His eyes flicked to the orb's pouch, its pulse steady but insistent, like a heartbeat quickening with anticipation. Ellen followed his gaze, frowning. "That light you carry, it's not just a trinket, is it? Those things came for us after you took it." Aldrich hesitated, then drew the orb from its pouch, holding it up in the dim light. Its golden glow cast faint shadows across his weathered face, illuminating the lines of doubt etched there. "The saffron chalice gave it to me," he said. "A keeper Lysara called it the last of the crown's light. It showed me what was. Fields, towers, my brothers. But it's more than memory. I feel it pulling me here, to the hollow." Elin's eyes widened, then narrowed. "The heart of the veil," she whispered, tracing the circled mark on her map. Father's tablet mentioned a light to a beacon buried deep. He thought it was gold, but maybe. She trailed off, her fingers brushing the parchment. "Maybe it's alive." Before Aldrich could respond, a sharp cry split the air, not a wraith's rumble, but a human scream, raw and desperate, echoing from the road below. He shoved the orb back into its pouch and drew his sword, motioning Elin to follow as he led Mistral down the slope. The ash muffled their steps, but the cry came again, closer, joined by the clatter of steel and a guttural snarl that set Aldrich's nerves alight. They rounded a bend in the road and froze. A man staggered toward them, his cloak torn, his face smeared with blood and ash. Behind him lumbered a beast, neither wraith nor man, but a hulking thing of sinew and bone, its body stitched with crude metal plates. Its head, a mass of horns and jagged teeth. Chains dangled from its wrists, dragging in the dust, and its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, fixed on its prey. Two other figures lay sprawled in the ash, their bodies broken, swords scattered beside them. The man saw Aldrich and stumbled forward, gasping, "Help, please!" The beast roared, lunging, and Aldrich shoved the man aside, meeting the charge with a swing of his sword. The blade caught the creature's arm, slicing through flesh but clanging against metal, the impact jarring his bones. The beast swiped with a clawed hand, and Aldrich ducked, the wind of it ruffling his cloak. Elin thrust her spear into its flank, the tip sinking deep, and the creature howled, yellow ichor oozing from the wound. "Fire!" Aldrich shouted, remembering the wraiths. Elin yanked a flint from her satchel, striking it against her dagger to spark a flame on a strip of cloth torn from her cloak. She hurled it at the beast, and the fire caught, spreading across its matted hide. It thrashed, roaring as the flames consumed it, and collapsed into a smoking heap, the stench of burnt flesh filling the air. Aldrich turned to the man who'd fallen to his knees, trembling. "Who are you?" he demanded, sword still raised. "Torin," the man rasped, his voice cracked with fear. "Scout, from the Hollow. We were tracking Hollowman raiders with the spiral mark. They've got a camp nearby, but that thing..." He gestured to the beast's corpse. It wasn't theirs. It came from the Hollow itself, ripped through us like paper. Elin knelt beside him, her face pale. "The spiral mark, same as the ones who killed my father. What do they want?" Torin coughed, spitting ash. "Power. They worship something down there, a voice in the dark. They've been digging, pulling up old things, tablets, bones, machines. That beast. It's one of their guardians. More'll come." Aldrich sheathed his sword, his mind racing. The orb pulsed harder now, its warmth seeping through the pouch, as if responding to Torin's words. "This voice," he said. "What does it promise them?" "Everything," Torin said, his eyes hollow. "Life, strength, a new kingdom. But it's a lie. I've seen what's left of their offerings. Nothing but ash and screams." A low rumble shook the ground, faint but growing, and Mistral whinnied, rearing. Aldrich grabbed Torin's arm, hauling him up. "Can you walk?" "Barely," Torin muttered, clutching a gash on his side. Elin supported him, her spear ready, as they retreated up the road. The rumble swelled, and from the haze behind them emerged more shapes, 3 beasts. This time, their yellow eyes glinting, chains clanking as they charged. "Ride," Aldrich shouted, leaping onto Mistral and pulling Elin and Torin up behind him. The mare bolted, ash flying beneath her hooves, but the beasts were fast, their roars shaking the air. Aldrich veered off the road, cutting through a field of skeletal trees, their branches snapping against his armor. The orb burned against his hip, its light leaking through the pouch, and one of the beasts veered toward it, its eyes flaring. "It's the light!" Elin yelled, clinging to Torin. "They're drawn to it!" Aldrich cursed, yanking the reins to dodge a claw that tore through a tree trunk. "Then we use it," he growled. He ripped the orb free, holding it aloft. The golden glow flared, blinding, and the beasts shrieked, faltering as the light seared their eyes. Mistral surged ahead, clearing the trees, and the hollow spires loomed closer, their bases swallowed by a churning mist. The beasts regained their footing, closing in, but a new sound joined the fray, a sharp whistle, followed by the twang of bowstrings. Arrows rained from the mist ahead, striking the beasts with precision, their tips glowing faintly blue. The creatures staggered, ichor spilling, and collapsed as a dozen figures emerged from the haze, cloaked in gray, armed with bows and short blades, their faces hidden behind ash-streaked masks. One stepped forward, lowering her bow. "You're late," she said, her voice muffled but firm. "The hollow's awake, and it knows you're here." Aldrich reined Mistral to a stop, the orb dimming in his hand. Torin slumped against Ellen, whispering, "The Watch. They're all that's left." The newcomers surrounded them, weapons ready, and the mist thickened, curling around the spires like a living thing. The Black Hollow waited, its secrets stirring, and Aldrich felt the orb's pull sharpen a call he could no longer ignore. The mist coiled around the spires of the Black Hollow like serpents, thick and restless, swallowing the faint blue glow of the Watch's arrows as they dragged the beast corpses into the haze. Aldrich steadied Mistral, the mare's flanks heaving from the chase, while the orb in his hand dimmed to a soft flicker, its warmth pulsing unevenly against his palm. Elin clung to Torin, her spear braced against the saddle, her eyes darting between the masked figures encircling them. The leader of the Watch, a woman by her slight frame and the timbre of her voice, stepped closer, her bow slung across her back, one hand resting on a curved blade at her hip. "You carry a light that doesn't belong here," she said, her mask tilting toward the orb. "It's woken things better left sleeping. Name yourself, Knight, before we decide your fate." "Sir Aldrich, once of the Saffron Crown," he replied, his voice steady despite the ache in his shoulder. "This is Elin, and Torin your scout if he speaks true. We're no threat to you, unless you make us one." The woman's posture stiffened, and a murmur rippled through the Watch. She pulled her mask aside, revealing a sharp face weathered by the veil-high cheekbones, a scar slicing across her brow, and eyes like chipped flint. "I'm Mara, captain of the Hollow Watch," she said. "Torin's one of ours, though he's a fool for running afoul of those chains pawn. But you..." Her gaze fixed on the orb. "That light's no stranger to us. It stirred the Hollowmen, the beasts, and worse." Elin slid from Mistral, helping Torin down as he groaned, clutching his side. "Worse?" she asked, her tone sharp. "What's worse than those things chasing us?" Mara didn't answer immediately, gesturing instead to her companions. Two of the Watch dragged a crude stretcher from the mist, laying Torin atop it, while others formed a perimeter, their bows trained on the shifting haze. "Follow us," she said finally. "The Hollow's edge isn't safe, especially not now. We'll talk where the shadows can't hear." Aldrich hesitated, the orb's pulse quickening in his grip. He tucked it back into its pouch, its glow muted but alive, and nodded. "Lead on." The Watch guided them through the mist, the hollow road fading behind as they wove between jagged outcrops and sunken ruins. The air grew heavy, tinged with a metallic tang, and the spires loomed larger, their tips vanishing into the swirling gray. Mara's pace was brisk, her silence broken only by clipped orders to her scouts, until they reached a sheltered hollow, a camp carved into the rock, its entrance draped with hides, lit by flickering braziers that cast long shadows across the stone. Inside, the watch dispersed to their posts, and Mara led Aldrich, Elin, and the stretcher-bound Torin to a rough-hewn table strewn with maps and scraps of parchment. She unrolled one, its edges blackened, revealing a sketch of the Black Hollow, a crater-like expanse ringed by spires, with tunnels snaking beneath. "This is where you're headed," she said, tapping the center. "The vault your father sought, girl. It's real, but it's no treasure hoard." Elin leaned forward, her map clutched tight. "The heart of the Vale, my father died for it." "What is it?" Mara's scarred brow furrowed. "A prison," she said. "Or it was, before the Hollowmen started digging. Something's buried there, older than the crown, older than the Vale itself. A voice that whispers power twists flesh into those beasts you fought. The Watch has guarded this place for generations, keeping it sealed. But your light," she pointed at Aldrich's pouch. "It's a key, and it's breaking the locks." Aldrich's hand tightened on the pouch, Lysara's words echoing in his mind. "Carry it, Sir Aldrich. The Vale is yours now. The saffron chalice gave it to me," he said. "A keeper called it the crown's last grace. It's no weapon of ruin." Mara's eyes darkened. "The chalice? Then you've been lied to, knight. That light's no grace, it's a shard of betrayal." She pulled a small object from her cloak, a pendant. Its metal warped but etched with a familiar saffron rune, cracked down the middle. "This came from a corpse we found near the hollow last season. One of yours, an order knight." He wasn't alone. Before Aldrich could speak, a low horn sounded outside, its note cutting through the camp. Mara cursed, grabbing her bow, and the watch sprang to action, weapons drawn. Aldrich followed her to the entrance, Elin at his side, as the mist parted to reveal a new threat. Figures emerged, clad not in the Hollowmen's crude hides, but in armor of blackened steel, their cloaks emblazoned with a broken sunburst. Their leader rode a skeletal steed, its ribs visible through tattered flesh, and held a staff topped with a jagged crystal that pulsed red. "The shattered dawn," Mara hissed, knocking an arrow. "They've come for your light." The leader raised his staff, his voice booming through the mist. "Sir Ulrich of the Saffron Crown, you bear the Dawn Shard, the key to our ascension. Surrender it, or we take it from your corpse." Aldrich drew his sword, the notched blade steady despite the shock rippling through him. "Who are you to claim it?" he shouted back, the orb flaring hot against his hip. "We are the true heirs," the man replied, his helm's visor lifting to reveal a face. Eerily familiar sharp features, a beard streaked with gray, eyes like Aldrich's own. "I am Sir Gavrin, once your brother in arms. The crown fell, but I rose reborn by the Vale's truth. That light was stolen from us, hidden by cowards like Lysara. Give it to me, and we'll remake what was lost." Elin gripped her spear, whispering, "Gavrin, you said he died." "He did," Aldrich said, his voice breaking. "I buried him myself. Yet there he stood, or some twisted echo of him, leading a faction that claimed the orb as their own." The shattered dawn advanced, their weapons glinting, and the ground trembled as more chain spawn roared from the mist. Their yellow eyes locked on the camp. Mara loosed her arrow, striking a dawn soldier in the chest, and chaos erupted. The watch clashed with the armored figures, blades ringing, while the chain spawn tore through the fray, claws rending stone and flesh alike. Aldrich charged Gavrin, his sword meeting the staff in a burst of sparks, the orb's light flaring wild as their eyes locked. "You're no Gavrin," Aldrich growled, parrying a blow. "He died for hope, not this." The man laughed, a hollow sound. Hope betrayed us. The veil showed me power, real power. Join me, Aldrich, or fall with the rest. Elin hurled her spear, catching a chain spawn mid-leap, and shouted, "He's not alone." She drew her dagger, standing back to back with Aldrich, as the watch fought to hold the line. The orb burned brighter, its glow spilling through the pouch, and the chain spawn howled, drawn to it like moths to flame. Mara yelled over the din, "The vault, it's waking! We can't hold them here." She pointed to a tunnel at the camp's rear. "Get to the hollow's heart, seal it, or destroy it. Go!" Aldrich parried another strike from Gavrin, or whatever wore his face, and broke away, grabbing Elin's arm. They bolted for the tunnel, Mistral galloping behind, as the shattered dawn and chainspawn pressed the watch to the breaking point. The orb pulsed like a second heart, its light a beacon and a curse, leading them deeper into the black hollow's shadowed maw. The tunnel swallowed Aldrich and Elin in a rush of darkness, the clamor of battle fading behind them as Mistral's hooves echoed off the damp stone walls. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of moss and rust, and the dawn shard's glow seeped through its pouch, casting jagged shadows that danced ahead like specters. Aldrich gripped his sword, its notched edge a familiar weight, though his mind churned with the face of Gavrin or the thing wearing it, those gray eyes twisted by something colder than death. Elin ran beside him, her dagger clutched tight, her breath ragged but her steps sure. The tunnel sloped downward, its walls narrowing until the spire's roots loomed overhead, twisted columns of rock veined with black, glistening faintly as if alive. The dawn shard pulsed faster, its warmth searing through Aldrich's glove, and a low hum vibrated through the stone, growing louder with each step. "It's pulling us," he muttered, half to himself, half to Elin. "Whatever's down there, it knows we're coming." "Then we don't stop," Elin said, her voice taut. "My father died chasing this whatever it is. We end it." She glanced back, the tunnel's mouth a faint gray blur. "Mara's people won't hold long. That. Gavrin, he's not human anymore." Aldrich's jaw tightened. "He was once my shield brother. We swore the same oaths, bled for the same king. If that's him, the veil's taken more than his life." The memory of piling stones over Gavrin's broken body clawed at him, his friend's last gasp, the chalice's name on his lips. Had Lysera known? Had she sent him into this trap? The tunnel opened abruptly into a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in shadow, its floor a cracked mosaic of ancient tiles spiraling toward a central pit. The hum became a pulse, a heartbeat that shook the air, and at the pit's edge stood a structure half altar, half machine, its surface wrought in blackened metal and studded with crystals that glowed a deep, throbbing red. Chains dangled from its sides, swaying as if caught in a breeze, though the air was still. At its heart, embedded in a slab of obsidian, pulsed a hollow space, a socket, empty but alive with a faint golden shimmer. Elin froze, her eyes wide. "The vault. It's here." She pulled her father's map from her satchel, its ink trembling in the dawn shard's light. That's where the tablet pointed the heart. But it's waiting. Aldrich approached the altar, the dawn shard flaring as he neared, its glow spilling across the mosaic. The socket pulsed in time, calling to it, and he felt a tug not just in his hand, but in his chest, a thread of longing and dread. "It fits," he said, voice low. "This is what Lysera meant the veil is mine to claim. But why?" Before Elin could answer, a clatter echoed from the tunnel steel on stone, voices rising in a guttural chant. Shadows stretched across the chamber's entrance as the shattered dawn emerged. Gavrin at their head, his staff aglow with crimson light. His soldiers fanned out, their blackened armor scarred from the watch's arrows, and behind them lumbered a chain spawn, its horns scraping the ceiling, its eyes locked on the Dawn Shard. "You can't run from destiny, Aldrich," Gavrin called, his voice a warped echo of the man he'd been. "The Dawn Shard belongs here. Its power will unbind the Veil's heart, and we'll rise as its masters. The crown was weak. We'll forge something stronger." Aldrich stepped in front of Elin, sword raised. "You're a puppet, Gavrin. Whatever's down there, it's using you. I saw you die. Your blood stained my hands. This isn't you." Gavrin laughed, the sound jagged and hollow. "Death was a door, brother. The Veil remade me, gave me eyes to see. Lysara hid the truth. She and the Keepers feared what we could become. Join me, or watch it claim you too." He thrust his staff forward, and the chain spawn charged, its chains whipping the air. Aldrich met it head on, ducking a claw and slashing at its leg, the blade biting deep. Ellen darted to the side, hurling her dagger at a Dawn soldier who crumpled with a cry. The chamber erupted in chaos. Steel clashed, the chainspawn roared, and the altar's red crystals flared, bathing the fight in a hellish glow. Aldrich drove his sword into the beast's chest, twisting until it collapsed, but more soldiers pressed in, their numbers swelling from the tunnel. Elin snatched a fallen spear, shouting, "The altar, it's waking up!" The socket's shimmer intensified, tendrils of golden light snaking toward the Dawn Shard in Aldrich's hand. He stumbled back, the orb burning hot, and Gavrin lunged, staff swinging for his wrist. Aldrich parried, their weapons locking, and for a moment, their faces were inches apart. Gavrin's eyes, no longer slate gray, but veined with red, his breath reeking of ash and decay. "It's too late," Gavrin hissed. "The heart wants its shard. Give it to me." Aldrich shoved him back, chest heaving. "Not while I breathe." He glanced at the altar, the socket now pulsing wildly, and made a choice. "Elin, cover me." She nodded, driving her spear into a soldier's thigh as Aldrich sprinted for the altar, the Dawn Shard outstretched. He slammed it into the socket, and the world shattered. Light exploded golden and red, blinding, searing, flooding the chamber as the mosaic cracked beneath his feet. A voice boomed, deep and ancient, not from the air but from within. "The shard returns. The seal breaks." The altar trembled, chains snapping free, and the pit yawned wider, revealing a chasm where something stirred, massive, shadowy, its edges rippling like liquid stone. Eyes opened within it, countless and glowing, fixed on Aldrich. Gavrin staggered, laughing maniacally. "Yes, the heart lives." His soldiers faltered, some dropping their weapons, others clawing at their helmets as the voice shook their minds. Elin grabbed Aldrich's arm, pulling him back as the chasm pulsed, tendrils of shadow lashing upward. "What did you do?" she yelled, her voice nearly lost in the roar. "I don't know," Aldrich rasped, watching in horror as the thing in the pit rose, a colossus of ash and stone, its form shifting between man and beast, crowned with horns that scraped the ceiling. The Dawn Shard glowed within the altar, feeding it, and the voice spoke again. "Freedom through ruin." Gavrin advanced, staff raised, but the colossus turned on him first. A tendril lashed out, wrapping his waist, and he screamed, a sound cut short as it crushed him into ash, his staff clattering to the ground. The soldiers fled, some consumed by the shadows, others vanishing into the tunnel. Aldrich and Elin backed away, Mistral rearing as the chamber shook, tiles falling like rain. "We have to stop it," Elin cried, pointing to the Dawn Shard, still pulsing in the altar. Aldrich nodded, shoving through the chaos to reach it, but the colossus roared, its eyes flaring, and a wave of force threw him back. The voice laughed, a sound that clawed at his soul. "The veil is mine again. You are too late." The chamber began to collapse, the spires above groaning as the mist thickened, and Aldrich realized Mara was right. The vault wasn't a treasure or a prison. It was a cage for something alive, something the Dawn Shard had unleashed. He grabbed Elin, pulling her toward Mistral. "We ride now." They mounted and fled, the tunnel trembling as the Colossus roared behind them, its tendrils clawing at the stone. The Dawn Shard's light faded in the distance, swallowed by the pit, and the black hollow shuddered, its heart awake and hungry. Ahead lay the camp or its ruins and beyond, a veil remade by the horror they'd set free. The tunnel buckled as Aldrich and Elin fled, Mistral's hooves pounding through a storm of falling stone and ash. The Colossus's roar chased them, a deafening bellow that split the air, its tendrils of shadow clawing at the walls, tearing chunks free as the black hollow convulsed. The Dawn Shard's golden light was gone, swallowed by the pit, but its absence left a void that pulsed in Aldrich's chest, a hollow ache, where hope had briefly flickered. Ellen clung to his back, her breath sharp against his neck, her spear lost in the chaos, her dagger now her only defense. The tunnel spat them into the Watch's camp, or what remained of it. The hides hung in tatters, braziers toppled, and bodies littered the ground. Mara's gray-cloaked warriors, their masks cracked, their blood staining the ash. The shattered Dawn soldiers lay among them, armor rent by chain-spawn claws or crushed by falling rock. Mara stood at the camp's edge, bow in hand, her scarred face streaked with soot as she loosed arrows into the mist. A handful of Watch survivors rallied around her, their blades flashing against a tide of chain-spawn surging from the haze. Aldrich reined Mistral to a halt, shouting, "Mara, the vault, it's free." His voice cracked, raw with exhaustion and dread. She turned, her flinty eyes narrowing as the ground trembled beneath them. "I felt it," she said, knocking another arrow. "The heart's awake, and it's coming for us all." A chain-spawn lunged, and she fired, the blue-tipped shaft piercing its eye. It collapsed, thrashing as she drew her blade. "We can't hold here. The hollow's lost." Elin slid from the saddle, grabbing a fallen spear. "The Dawn Shard, it's still in there, feeding that thing. We have to get it back." "No time," Mara snapped, slashing at another beast. "Run, or die." But Aldrich's gaze drifted to the tunnel's mouth, where shadows boiled, the Colossus's eyes dozens, glowing like embers piercing the mist. The voice echoed again, softer now but piercing. "The veil bends to me. Your light is mine." He thought of Gavrin's twisted face, Lysara's cryptic warning, the vision of golden fields and the weight of his oath, frayed but unbroken. He dismounted, handing Mistral's reins to Elin. "I started this," he said, his tone steady despite the chaos. "I'll end it. Take Mara, get clear." Elin's eyes widened. "Aldrich, no you can't, go," he roared, shoving her toward Mistral. She hesitated, then nodded, tears cutting tracks through the ash on her face as she mounted with Mara behind her. The Watch captain met his gaze, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, and then Mistral bolted, carrying them into the mist as the remaining Watch covered their retreat. Aldrich turned to face the tunnel, sword in hand, the notched blade a dull gleam in the fading light. The Colossus emerged, its form towering stone and shadow fused into a nightmare of horns and claws, its countless eyes fixed on him. Tendrils lashed out, and he rolled aside, the ground shattering where he'd stood. He sprinted back into the tunnel, the beast's roar shaking the walls, its bulk forcing its way through the narrowing passage. The chamber loomed ahead, the altar cracked but standing, the Dawn Shard pulsing faintly within its socket. The pit churned, a maelstrom of ash and shadow, the Colossus's true form still rising, its voice a thunder in his skull. "You cannot undo what is begun." Aldrich ignored it, leaping onto the altar as tendrils snapped at his heels. He gripped the Dawn Shard, its heat searing his hand, and yanked it free. The chamber shuddered, the red crystals dimming, and the colossus howled a sound of rage and pain. The golden light flared in Aldrich's grasp, brighter than before, flooding the pit with a radiance that burned the shadows back. He stumbled, the force knocking him to his knees, and saw at a crack in the colossus's chest a pulsing core of black stone veined with red, exposed by the light. "You want this?" he shouted, raising the dawn shard. "Take it!" He hurled himself forward, sword in one hand, orb in the other, and drove both into the core. The blade sank deep, steel grinding against stone, and the dawn shard flared, its light pouring into the wound like liquid fire. The colossus screamed, a sound that tore at the veil itself, and the chamber collapsed around them, tiles raining, walls crumbling, the pit ceiling shut as the entity thrashed. Aldrich felt the ground give way, the light consuming him, and then silence. When Elin and Mara broke through the mist, the Black Hollow spires were falling, their bases crumbling into the ash. The ground stilled, the roars faded, and a faint golden glow rose from the ruins, dissipating into the gray sky. Elin reined Mistral to a stop, her chest tight, staring at the wreckage where Aldrich had vanished. Mara dismounted, her bow slack in her hand, and knelt, pressing a fist to her scarred brow. "He did it," Mara said, voice low. "The heart's gone." Elin slid from the saddle, her legs trembling. "He didn't come back." She clutched the map, her father's legacy, its edges frayed like the hope she'd carried. Tears fell, but she wiped them away, gazing at the horizon where the veil stretched. Quieter now, its shadows softened. Mistral nickered, nudging her, and from the ash at their feet, a glint caught her eye, a shard of saffron metal, cracked but warm, all that remained of the dawn shard. Elin picked it up, its faint pulse a whisper of Aldrich's last stand. "He gave us a chance," she said, her voice breaking but firm. "To rebuild, to remember." Mara rose, nodding. "The watch will carry on. For him. For all of them." They turned south, Mistral plodding beside them, the shard in Elin's hand a beacon of what could be a light not to conquer the veil, but to pierce its darkness, one step at a time. Behind them, the Black Hollow lay silent, a tomb for a knight who'd traded his life for a dawn he'd never see, his oath fulfilled in a blaze of gold that echoed through the ash forever. Before we continue to the next chapter, please take 3 seconds to comment below. Let us know where you're from and what time it is where you live. Wishing everyone a joyful and wonderful day ahead and a peaceful good night's sleep. Thank you all for joining us until the end of this story. Chapter 2, The Hollow Shield. The wind howled across the jagged peaks of the Thornskull Range, a mournful wail that carried flecks of snow and the scent of pine down into the shadowed valley below. The road here was little more than a scar of dirt and stone, winding through a landscape of gray cliffs and twisted, leafless trees that clawed at the sky like desperate hands. At its edge trudged a warrior, his armor dented and dulled by years of battle, the once bright sigil of a crowned stag on his breastplate faded to a ghost of silver. His name was Torin, though few still spoke it, a man whose broad shoulders now stooped under the weight of a longs, word strapped across his back and a shield slung over one arm cracked, its rim notched from blows. It could no longer recall. His helm hung at his belt, rattling with each step, leaving his face bare to the cold, a face carved by time and scars, with a beard streaked gray and eyes like storm clouds, heavy with the weariness of too many wars. He'd fought for lords whose names he'd forgotten, in fields now reclaimed by weeds, for causes that crumbled like ash in his hands. The last battle had been weeks ago, or perhaps months, a blur of steel and screams beneath a sky red with dawn, and he'd walked away when the banners fell, leaving the dead to the crows. Now his boots crunched on frost, his breath rasped in his chest, and the valley offered no promise but the next step. Ahead, a flicker of movement caught his eye, a figure, slight and cloaked, stepping from the trees onto the road. The traveler wore a mantle of patched brown wool, its hood drawn low, and carried a staff crowned with a shard of amber that gleamed faintly in the dim light. A satchel hung at their side, bulging with unseen burdens, and their pace was unhurried, as if the wind's bite meant nothing. Torin slowed, his hand drifting to his sword's hilt, though his arm ached at the thought of drawing it. The valley was no place for strangers, yet this one moved with a quiet certainty that pricked at his instincts. The traveler stopped a dozen paces away, planting the staff in the earth, and lifted their hood just enough to reveal a face young, or perhaps ageless, with skin pale as moonlight and eyes that shimmered green, like jade caught in a stream. "A cold day to bear such weight," they said, their voice soft but clear, cutting through the wind's howl. "What drives a warrior down a road this bleak?" Torin's grip on his sword eased, though his gaze remained sharp. "Habit," he grunted, his voice rough as the stones underfoot. "And the hope of a fire before the night takes me." "You're far from any hearth yourself, traveler. What's your purpose here?" The traveler tilted their head, the amber atop their staff pulsing once, a heartbeat of light. "I seek the hollow shield," they said, the words hanging in the air like a riddle, a relic, or so the tales claim, lost in these mountains. They say it guards more than flesh holds memory, maybe truth. I've walked from the lowlands to find it. They paused, studying him, the wind tugging at their cloak. "You've the look of one who's carried shields aplenty. Know of it?" Torin's brow furrowed, his cracked shield shifting on his arm as if in answer. He'd heard whispers of the hollow shield, old campfire tales from soldiers too drunk to care, about a shield forged by a smith who wept blood, its surface blank but heavy with the past. He'd thought it a myth, like so much else he'd buried. "Heard of it," he said, his tone guarded. "Never seen it. If it's real, the thorn skull's a cruel place to hunt for it. You'll freeze before you dig it from these rocks." The traveler smiled, a flicker of warmth in the cold. "Perhaps. But the wind speaks here, if you listen. It led me to you, warrior. Torin, isn't it?" They stepped closer, the staff tapping the ground, and Torin tensed, his name on their lips a jolt through his weariness. "I've no gift for swords, but I've a nose for paths. Join me, and we'll find it together, a fire for you, a relic for me. The valley's kinder to two than one." He stared at them, the wind whipping snow between them, and felt the ache in his bones war with a spark of something older curiosity, or maybe the ghost of purpose. "How do you know my name?" he demanded, his voice a growl, but the traveler only shrugged, the amber glinting again. "The wind carries more than snow," they said. "Names linger where battles fade. Come, Torin. There's a cave a mile hence. I smell smoke on the air. Rest there and decide." Torin hesitated, his shield a dead weight against his side, then nodded once, sharp and grudging. "A mile," he said. "Then we talk. I've no patience for riddles." He fell into step beside them, his boots matching the rhythm of their staff, and the valley stretched before them, its cliffs looming like sentinels in the dusk. The cave emerged from the mist as promised, a gash in the mountainside framed by icicles that gleamed like teeth. A faint thread of smoke drifted from its mouth, and within, a fire burned low, its logs stacked by hands long gone. Torin eased his shield to the ground, the crack in its center catching the light, and sank onto a stone, the heat thawing his stiff limbs. The traveler knelt by the flames, adding a branch from their satchel, and the cave filled with the scent of resin and earth. "You've a fire now," they said, settling cross-legged, their cloak pooling around them. "Tell me, Torin, what's a warrior like you fleeing, or chasing, in a place like this?" He stared into the flames, the scars on his hands darkened the glow. Nothing to flee, he muttered. Nothing left to chase. Just walking till the road ends. His shield lay beside him, its notches a map of forgotten fights, and he wondered, briefly, if the hollow shield could hold more than his own, had more than blood and broken oaths. The traveler's eyes glinted, green and knowing. The road doesn't end here, they said. Not yet. The hollow shield's close, I feel it, like a song under the stone. Rest, warrior. Tomorrow we climb. The fire crackled. The wind howled beyond the cave, and Torin leaned back, the weight of his armor easing for the first time in days. The traveler hummed softly, a tune older than the mountains, and the valley waited, its secrets buried deep. The fire in the cave burned low through the night, its embers casting a faint red glow across the stone walls, where shadows flickered like memories of forgotten things. Torin slept fitfully, his back against the rock, his cracked shield resting beside him like a loyal hound too tired to stand. The wind outside wailed, a chorus of voices that slipped into his dreams, clashing steel, the cries of men he'd led and lost, the hollow thud of arrows striking flesh. He woke before dawn, his breath a cloud in the chill air, to find the traveler already stirring the fire, their amber-tipped staff leaning against the wall, its light pulsing faintly as if alive. "Dreams cling to you like burrs," they said without looking up, feeding a twist of dry moss to the flames. The fire flared, illuminating their face-sharp cheekbones, those uncanny green eyes that seem to see too much. The thorn skull keeps them close, feeds on them. "Did you see battles past, or something more?" Torin grunted, rubbing a hand over his face, the stubble rough against his palm. "Battles," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Always battles. They don't leave a man, even when the war does." He reached for his shield, its weight familiar as he slung it over his arm, the crack in its center a silent reproach. "You said the shield's close. Where?" The traveler rose, brushing dirt from their cloak, and tapped the staff against the ground, the amber flaring brighter. "Up," they said, nodding toward the cave's mouth. "The wind's been singing all night, can't you hear it? A note deeper than the rest, under the howl. It's in the cliffs, carved into the stone. We climb at first light." They stepped outside, the mist swirling around them, and Torin followed, his joints protesting as he stretched, the cold seeping through his armor. The sky was a slate of gray, the peaks of the Thornskull Range jagged against it, their tips lost in clouds that promised more snow. The traveler led the way, their staff a steady beat against the frost, guiding them up a narrow trail that snaked along the mountainside. The path was treacherous, loose shale slid underfoot, and roots erupted from the earth like traps, but the traveler moved with an ease that belied the terrain, their cloak barely stirring in the wind. Torin kept pace, his breath harsh, his shield banging against his hip with each step. The air grew thinner, sharper, carrying a faint tang of iron that prickled his nose. They climbed for hours, the valley shrinking below them into a haze of white and gray, the trees reduced to dark specks. The wind grew louder, its wail threading with that deeper note the traveler had named a hum, resonant and mournful, like a horn blown from the earth's depths. It pulled at Torin, stirring something in his chest he couldn't name, a call older than the battles he'd fought. The traveler stopped at a ledge, the cliff face rising sheer before them, its surface pocked with fissures and streaked with veins of black stone that glinted like wet ink. "There," they said, pointing the staff at a crevice wide enough for a man to slip through. The amber glowed, casting light into the gap, revealing a tunnel that sloped downward, its walls smooth as if carved by water or hands long gone. The song's strongest here. The hollow shield waits. Torin peered into the dark, his hand resting on his sword. "If it's a trap," he said, his tone flat, "I'll not go quietly." The traveler's lips quirked. a smile that didn't reach their eyes, and they slipped into the crevice without reply, their staffs light a beacon in the gloom. Torin followed, the stone cold against his shoulders, the tunnel narrowing until his armor scraped the walls, the sound echoing like a blade on a whetstone. The passage opened into a chamber, vast and silent, its ceiling a dome of jagged rock that shimmered with flecks of quartz, catching the amber light like stars trapped in stone. The floor was smooth, worn by time, and at its center stood a plinth, a slab of granite, rough-hewn, bearing a shield unlike any Torin had seen. It was large, its surface a dull gray that drank the light, its edges curved inward as if melted, and its center hollowed out, a shallow basin etched with runes that pulsed faintly blue. The hum was deafening here, vibrating through the stone, the air, the marrow of his bones, and Torin felt it pull at him, a tide he couldn't resist. The traveler approached, their staff held high, and the shield's runes flared brighter, casting shadows that danced across the chamber. The hollow shield, they murmured, their voice reverent, forged by the first wardens, they say, to hold what blades can't cut. Not steel, not flesh, but time, regret, the weight of what's lost. They turned to Torin, their green eyes glinting. Touch it, warrior. It knows you. Torin stepped forward, his cracked shield heavy on his arm, and hesitated. The hum sang in his blood, a dirge for every battle, every fallen friend, every oath he'd broken. He set his old shield aside, its thud muffled by the stone, and reached out, his scarred hand hovering over the hollow. The air thickened, the runes pulsed, and he pressed his palm to the cold metal. A rush filled him, not pain, not warmth, but a flood of memory, sharp and unrelenting. He saw the fields of Dornvale, the mud red with blood, his brother's face as the arrow took him, the walls of Highkeep burning under a siege he couldn't stop, the girl in the village, her eyes wide as he rode away, leaving her to the raiders. Each moment poured into the shield, draining from him like water from a cracked cup, leaving him lighter, emptier, yet whole. The hum softened, the runes dimmed, and when he pulled his hand away, the hollow glowed faintly, as if holding what he'd given. The traveler watched, their staff still, their expression unreadable. It takes, they said, and it keeps. What's left is yours to carry or leave behind. Torin flexed his hand, the scars stark against his skin, and felt the absence not of strength, but of burden. What now? He asked, his voice steadier than it had been in years. The traveler shrugged, the amber flickering. The shield stays. Its purpose is here, guarding what it holds. You've a road still, Torin, down the mountain or beyond it. I'll walk my own. They turned, the staff tapping as they moved back toward the tunnel, leaving him with the shield and the silence. Torin lingered, the chamber's glow fading, the wind's song a whisper now. He hefted his cracked shield, its weight a shadow of what it once meant, and followed the traveler's light, the Thornskull Range, stretching vast and unforgiving around them. The tunnel's stone pressed close, as Torin followed the traveler's amber light, the glow casting jagged shadows that flickered like the ghosts of his memories, now held by the hollow shield. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of moss and minerals, and the hum of the relic faded behind him. A receding tide that left his chest lighter, but his mind restless. His boots scraped the floor, the sound swallowed by the mountain, and his cracked shield hung at his side, its notches catching the faint illumination, a relic of his own, emptied of meaning yet tethered to him still. Ahead, the traveler moved with that same unhurried grace, their staff tapping a rhythm against the stone, the amber pulsing as if it breathed. They emerged onto the ledge, the Thornskull Range sprawling beneath a sky now streaked with the first threads of dawn, pale gold, bleeding into the gray, softening the peak's harsh edges. The wind had eased, its howl reduced to a sigh that rustled the sparse, brittle grass clinging to the cliffside. Torin paused, his breath misting in the cold, and gazed down at the valley, a sea of mist pierced by the dark spears of trees. The road they'd walked, lost to the haze. The traveler stood beside him, their cloak fluttering faintly, their green eyes tracing the horizon as if reading a map only they could see. "You gave it something," they said, their voice cutting through the stillness, soft but deliberate. "The shield took a piece of you. What was it, warrior? Honor? Grief? A name you can't speak?" Torin's hand tightened on his shield strap, the cracked wood digging into his palm. He thought of the flood that had poured from him, Dornvale's blood-soaked fields, Highkeep's burning walls, the girl's wide eyes, and felt the hollow where they'd lived. "All of it," he said, his tone rough but steady. "Every damn thing I carried that wasn't steel. It's gone, and I'm still here. What's that make me?" The traveler turned, their staff planted firm, the amber flaring briefly. "A man," they said, a faint smile tugging at their lips. "Or what's left of one. The hollow shield doesn't erase, it holds. You're not empty, Torin, just unburdened. The road cares little for what you were, only what you do next." He snorted, a sound halfway between a laugh and a scoff, and shifted his shield to his back, its weight lighter than it should have been. "Next," he muttered, "always a next. Down the mountain, you said. Where do you go then? Chasing another relic, another song in the wind?" The traveler's smile widened, a glint of something mirth or secrets shimmering in their eyes. "Always," they replied. "The world's full of things lost, waiting to be found. I'll walk west, past the range, where the rivers turn to glass and the trees sing at dusk. There's a horn there, or so the whispers say, blown by a king who forgot his crown. You're welcome to follow, if your legs hold." Torin glanced westward, where the peaks softened into rolling hills shrouded in mist, their outlines blurred by distance. The thought of another march, another hunt, stirred the ache in his bones, but the lightness in his chest tugged at him to a pull he hadn't felt since the days before the wars, when the road was a promise, not a penance. "Maybe," he said, his voice low. "First I need meat and a fire that's not half dead. You smell smoke down there?" The traveler tilted their head, sniffing the air, then nodded. "A village, I'd wager, tucked in the valley's crook. Wood smoke and bread faint, but there, half a day's walk, if the path holds." They started down the trail, the staff's amber guiding the way, and Torin fell into step, the mountain slope gentler. Now, the shale giving way to packed earth and tufts of grass. The descent was slow, the dawn light creeping across the range, painting the cliffs in hues of amber and rose. The wind carried snatches of sound, distant bleats of goats, the creak of a cart's wheel, and Torin's stomach growled, the promise of food sharpening his focus. The traveler hummed again, that same old tune, its notes weaving through the air like a thread of silver, and he found his steps matching its rhythm, the weariness in his limbs easing with each stride. The village emerged from the mist. As the sun climbed higher, a cluster of thatched roofs and stone walls nestled against a bend in the river, its waters sluggish and dark. Smoke curled from chimneys, and figures moved in the haze, farmers with pitchforks, children chasing a dog through the mud. A wooden bridge spanned the river, its planks weathered but sturdy, and beyond it stood an inn, its sign swaying in the breeze, painted with a crude image of a boar's head. The traveler paused at the bridge, their staff resting in the crook of their arm, and glanced at Torin. "Fire and meat," they said, their tone light. "Your road pauses here, I think. Mine goes on." They stepped aside, gesturing toward the inn, the amber dimming as if bowing out. Torin studied the village, the warmth of its hearths calling to him, then looked back at the traveler. "You're not stopping?" he asked, though he knew the answer. Their kind didn't rest, not like he did, not while the wind still sang. Not yet, they said, adjusting their satchel. The horn waits, and the rivers don't sleep. But I'll leave you this. They reached into their cloak and pulled out a small pouch, its leather tied with a cord, and tossed it to him. He caught it, the weight slight but solid, and opened it to find a handful of dried berries and a stone, smooth and black, etched with a single rune that glowed faintly gold. For the road, they added, or what's left of it. Torin tucked the pouch into his belt, the stone's warmth seeping through the leather, and nodded. West, then, he said. If I find you again, traveler, you owe me a tale. No riddles. Their laugh was soft, a ripple in the morning air. A bargain, warrior. Safe paths, Torin. They turned, their cloak blending into the mist, and vanished down the western trail, the staff's amber a fading star in the haze. Torin crossed the bridge, the planks creaking under his boots, and pushed open the inn's door. The heat of a roaring fire washed over him, carrying the scent of roasting pork and ale, and he sank onto a bench, his cracked shield propped beside him. The innkeeper, a stout man with a flour-dusted apron, set a plate before him, and Torin ate in silence. The village's hum, a quiet companion. The hollow shield's echo lingered in his mind, a weight lifted but a question unanswered, and he wondered as the fire crackled where the road would take him next. The inn's fire roared in its hearth, a beast of flame and shadow that cast a warm glow across the low-beamed ceiling and the rough-hewn tables scattered about. Torin sat hunched over his meal, the plate before him piled with slabs of pork glazed with fat, a hunk of rye bread still steaming from the oven, and a wooden mug of ale that frothed at the rim. The meat was tender, its salt and smoke a balm to his hunger, and he tore into it with a quiet ferocity, the crackle of the fire blending with the murmur of voices around him, farmers swapping tales of the harvest, a woman chiding a child for spilling stew, the innkeeper's gruff laugh as he poured from a cask behind the counter. The room was alive with the hum of simple life, a stark contrast to the Thorn's Coal's bleak silence, and Torin felt it settle into him, thawing the chill that had clung to his bones since the mountain. His cracked shield rested against the bench, its notches catching the light, a silent witness to the battles it had endured. He traced its edge with a calloused finger, the wood splintered but familiar, and thought of the hollow shield, its cold, rune-etched surface, the way it had drunk his memories like a parched man at a well. The weight of those years was gone, yet he felt its absence like a phantom limb, a space he didn't know how to fill. The innkeeper lumbered over, a jug of ale in hand, his apron streaked with grease and flour. "Another?" he asked, his voice a rumble, and Torin nodded, sliding his mug across the table. The man poured, the liquid glinting amber in the firelight, and squinted at Torin's armor, the faded stag sigil barely visible beneath the dents. "You've the look of a soldier," he said, resting the jug on his hip. "Come down from the range, eh?" Not many pass through these days too cold, too cursed, they say. Torin took a long pull of the ale, its bitterness sharp on his tongue, and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Cursed or not, it's behind me," he said, his tone flat. "What's this place called?" "Stonewell," the innkeeper replied, scratching his beard. "Named for the river and the walls that keep the wolves out. Quiet, mostly goats, grain, a bit of trade when the roads are clear. You staying or just passing?" His eyes flicked to the shield. Curious but not pressing. Torin shrugged, his gaze drifting to the fire. "Passing, maybe. Haven't decided." The words felt true, though the thought of moving on tugged at him, a thread tied to the traveler's parting words west, where the rivers turned to glass. He reached into his belt and pulled out the pouch they'd given him, loosening the cord to spill the contents onto the table. The dried berries rolled free, dark and shriveled. and the black stone clinked against the wood, its golden rune glowing faintly, a whisper of warmth against his skin. The innkeeper's brows rose and he leaned closer, his voice dropping. "That's no common trinket," he said, nodding at the stone. "Looks like warden work old as the hills, from before the range went sour. Where'd you come by it?" "A traveler," Torin said, closing his fingers around the stone, its heat pulsing like a heartbeat. "Said it was for the road. Know anything of wardens?" The innkeeper straightened, his expression shifting to something wary. "Aye, tales mostly. Folk who guarded the old ways built things that lasted, shields and stones and such. They're gone now, swallowed by the mists, but their marks turn up sometimes. That rune's for strength, or memory, hard to say which. Keep it close, soldier. Things like that don't come free." Torin tucked the stone back into the pouch, the berries too, and drained his mug, the ale settling heavy in his belly. The innkeeper wandered off, called by a shout from the kitchen, and Torin leaned back, the bench creaking under his weight. The fire's warmth seeped into his armor, loosening the stiffness in his shoulders, and he watched the flames dance, their shapes blurring into echoes of the hollow shield's chamber, the quartz-starred ceiling, the rune's blue pulse, the traveler's knowing smile. Sleep tugged at him, a tide he couldn't fight, and he paid the innkeeper a handful of coppers for a bed upstairs, a narrow cot in a room that smelled of straw and damp wool, its single window rattling in the wind. He stripped off his armor, the breastplate clanging as he set it by the wall, and lay down, his sword within reach, the cracked shield propped beside him like a sentinel. The stone in its pouch rested against his chest, its warmth a quiet anchor, and he drifted into a dreamless sleep, the village's hum fading into the night. Dawn came soft and gray, the light seeping through the window to paint the room in muted hues. Torin woke to the distant clang of a smith's hammer, the bleat of goats beyond the walls, and rose, his body aching but steadier than it had been in weeks. He donned his armor, the stag sigil a faint shadow on his chest, and slung the shield over his arm, its crack a reminder of what he'd left behind. Downstairs, the inn was quiet, the fire banked to embers, a girl sweeping the rushes with a broom too big for her hands. She offered him a heel of bread and a strip of dried meat, and he took them with a nod, stepping out into the morning. The village stirred around him, the mist thinning to reveal Stonewell's modest sprawl stone houses with smoke curling from their chimneys, a mill by the river turning slow and steady, a boy driving a flock of goats across the bridge. Torin chewed the meat, its salt sharp against his tongue, and felt the road call again, not down into the valley's comfort, but west, where the traveler had gone. He pulled the stone from its pouch, its rune glowing brighter now, a golden thread in the dull light, and closed his fist around it, the warmth spreading through his hand. The wind shifted, carrying a faint hum, not the hollow shield song, but something new, distant, and alive, like the echo of a horn over water. Torin's eyes narrowed, tracing the western hills, their slopes shrouded in mist that shimmered faintly, as if kissed by glass. He adjusted his shield, the crack catching the dawn, and started across the bridge, the river's dark waters rippling beneath him. The road stretched ahead, winding into the unknown, and for the first time in years, Torin felt it pull not with weariness, but with a flicker of something he'd thought lost purpose. The road west from Stonewell unfurled like a ribbon of earth through the mist, its edges softened by frost, kissed grass, and the occasional jut of stone worn smooth by time. Torin walked with a steady stride, his cracked shield slung over his back, its weight a familiar ache against his spine. The air was crisp, carrying the bite of early winter and the faint scent of wood smoke from the village fading behind him. His boots crunched on the path, the sound a quiet counterpoint to the river's murmur to his left, its dark waters narrowing as it wound toward the hills. The black stone in his pouch pulsed warmly against his chest, its golden rune a steady glow beneath his tunic, urging him onward like a compass forged of memory. The Thornskull Range loomed to his right, its peaks softening into rugged slopes as the terrain dipped and rolled, the jagged cliffs giving way to forests of pine and ash. The trees stood tall and sparse, their branches bare save for clusters of needles that shivered in the wind, casting long shadows across the road as the sun climbed higher, a pale disk shrouded in clouds. Torin chewed the last of the dried meat from Stonewell, its salt lingering on his tongue, and scanned the horizon. The traveler had spoken of rivers turning to glass and trees that sang at dusk riddles, as always, but the hum he'd heard at dawn lingered in his ears, a thread of sound that wove through the wind's sigh. The day wore on, the mist thinning to a haze that clung to the hollows, revealing a land both wild and ancient. He passed a crumbling wall of stacked stones, its mortar long eroded, and a circle of charred earth where a fire had burned weeks or months before, its ashes scattered by the wind. Once, a hare darted across his path, its fur gray as the sky, vanishing into the underbrush with a rustle that broke the silence. Torin's hand rested on his sword's hilt, an old habit, though the road felt empty, not hostile, but watchful, as if the hills themselves held their breath. By midday, the forest thickened, the pines closing in until their branches formed a canopy overhead, filtering the light into a dappled glow. The road narrowed, its dirt giving way to moss-slick stones, and the river veered closer, its waters slowing to a glassy sheen that mirrored the trees and sky. Torin paused, crouching by its bank, and dipped a hand into the current. It was cold, unnaturally so, and smooth as polished steel, rippling only faintly under his touch before settling back into stillness. He frowned, the traveler's words echoing in his mind. Rivers turned to glass and rose, wiping his hand on his cloak, the stone's warmth flaring briefly as if in answer. The hum grew louder now, a low resonance that vibrated through the ground, threading with the wind's rustle to form a melody both mournful and alive. Torin followed it, the path curving deeper into the wood, the trees growing older, their trunks gnarled and thick, with lichen that glowed faintly green in the shadows. The air shimmered, a trick of light or something more, and he felt the stone pulse faster, its heat seeping through his armor. Ahead, the forest opened into a clearing, and he stopped, his breath catching at the sight before him. A river stretched across the glade, not water, but glass, its surface solid and gleaming, reflecting the pines and the sky in perfect clarity. It flowed from a spring in the earth, a pool of molten light that hardened as it spread, forming a ribbon of crystal that wound through the clearing and vanished into the trees beyond. The hum came from here, a song born of the glass itself, its surface trembling faintly with each note, and at its edge stood a tree unlike the rest, tall and silver-barked, its branches laden with leaves of translucent white that sang in the breeze, their edges chiming like bells. Torin stepped closer, his boots silent on the moss, and drew the stone from its pouch. Its rune blazed now, a golden fire that matched the spring's glow, and the glass river rippled, as if recognizing its kin. The tree's song shifted, its notes rising into a call that tugged at him, not the hollow. Shield's heavy pull, but something lighter, sharper, a summons to listen. He knelt by the river's edge, the glass cool under his hand, and saw shapes in its depths, not reflections, but images, a crowned figure blowing a horn atop a tower, a host of warriors clad in silver, a sky torn by streaks of light. They flickered and faded, leaving only the hum and the trees' chime. A shadow moved behind him, and he turned, his sword half drawn, to find the traveler standing at the clearing's edge. Their cloak was dusted with frost, their green eyes glinting in the glass's light, the amber staff steady in their hand. "You found it," they said, their voice blending with the song. "The Glassvale River and the singing ash. The horns not far now up the tower where the king last stood." Torin rose, sheathing his blade, the stone still warm in his fist. "You knew I'd come," he said, his tone edged with suspicion. "This stone you're doing?" The traveler shrugged, stepping onto the glass, their boots leaving no mark. "A nudge," they admitted. "The warden's work calls its own. You're not done walking, Torin. The horn's yours to claim, if you've the strength left." They gestured westward, where the trees parted to reveal a spire of stone rising from the forest, its peak shrouded in mist. Torin looked to the tower, the hum filling his chest, and felt the road stretch before him once more, not with weariness, but with a quiet fire he hadn't known since youth. "Let on," he said, the shield on his back a steady weight, and followed the traveler across the glass, the song of the ash ringing in his ears. The Glassvale River shimmered beneath Torin's boots as he crossed its crystalline expanse, each step a whisper against its surface, the hum of its song vibrating through his soles. The traveler led the way, their staff tapping a rhythm that echoed the singing ash's chime, its translucent leaves glinting like shards of moonlight in the fading day. The tower loomed ahead, a spire of weathered stone thrusting from the forest's heart, its walls streaked with moss and cracked by centuries of wind and frost. Ivy clung to its base, its tendrils curling around broken windows like fingers guarding secrets, and the mist clung thick to its peak, shrouding the top in a veil of gray. Torin's breath rasped in the cold, his cracked shield a steady weight on his back, the black stone in his hand pulsing with a warmth that steadied his grip. The traveler paused at the tower's base, where a door of iron-banded oak hung ajar, its hinges rusted but intact, and turned to him, their green eyes catching the glass's glow. "The horn's up there," they said, their voice soft but firm. "The king's last stand, his final call. It's yours if you take it, Torin, but the tower keeps its own price." He nodded, his jaw tight, and pushed past them, the door groaning as he shouldered it open. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of damp stone and decay, and a spiral stair wound upward, its steps uneven and slick with moss. The traveler followed, their staffs amber casting a pool of light that danced along the walls, revealing carvings worn by time warriors with spears, a crowned figure blowing a horn, a sky split by jagged lines of fire. The hum grew louder, a resonant pulse that thrummed in Torin's chest, syncing with the stone's glow, urging him on. The climb was slow, his legs burning with each step, the shield's strap digging into his shoulder. The wind whistled through the tower's cracks, carrying snatches of the singing ash's song, and he felt the weight of the hollow shield's gift, or its theft, settle into him. The memories it had taken were gone, but something remained, a spark kindled by the road, the traveler, the stone. He gripped the rune-etched rock tighter, its heat a lifeline, and pressed upward, the stair narrowing until it spilled into a chamber at the tower's peak. The room was open to the sky, its roof long collapsed, the mist swirling through gaps in the walls like a living thing. At its center stood a pedestal of black marble, veined with silver, and atop it rested the horn long and curved, forged of bone and brass, its surface etched with runes that shimmered faintly gold. It was smaller than he'd expected, yet its presence filled the space, the hum emanating from it a deep, mournful note that shook the stones beneath his feet. The traveler stepped beside him, their cloaks still, their eyes fixed on the relic. The horn of Ver, they murmured almost to themselves, blown by King Ulrich when the skies fell, calling his host to a battle they couldn't win. It holds his voice, his will. Take it, Torin, and it's yours to sound or to silence. Torin approached, the wind tugging at his cloak, and lifted the horn from its perch. It was light, its surface warm as if kissed by a flame, and the runes flared brighter at his touch, the hum rising into a song that filled his skull. He raised it to his lips, hesitating, the traveler's words echoing, "The tower keeps its own price." He thought of the hollow shield, the memories it had claimed, and wondered what this would take. But the road had led him here, through weariness and loss, and he blew. The sound was thunder and whisper, a call that tore through the mist and echoed across the Thornskull Range, shaking the trees, the glass river, the very earth. It was Ulrich's voice, fierce and broken, a king's defiance against a sky that burned, and Torin felt it surge through him strength, sorrow, a purpose he'd buried under years of steel and blood. The tower trembled, stones shifting, and the mist parted, revealing a sky streaked with fading light, the sun sinking behind the hills, in a blaze of amber and red. The note faded, the horn growing heavy in his hands, and Torin lowered it, his breath ragged, his chest tight with something new, not weariness, but resolve. The traveler watched, their smile faint but real, and stepped to the edge of the chamber, gazing westward, where the rivers gleamed like mirrors in the dusk. "You claimed it," they said. "The horn of Ver is yours. What will you do with it, warrior?" Torin turned the horn in his hands, its runes dimming to a soft glow, and felt the stone at his chest pulse in time with his heartbeat. "Keep it," he said, his voice steady. "Sound it when the road calls. I'm done running from battles or toward them. Let them find me, if they will." He slung the horn over his shoulder, its weight a companion to the shield, and looked to the traveler. "You're leaving?" They nodded, the amber staff flaring as they turned. "Always," they said. "The world's got more songs, more relics. I'll hear them out. You've a fire in you now, Torin, don't let it gutter." They stepped down the stair, their cloak blending into the shadows, and were gone, the hum of their presence fading into the wind. Torin stood alone, the tower silent save for the breeze, the horn warm against his side. He looked out over the range, the glass rivers shimmering below, the singing ash chiming faintly in the distance, and felt the road shift, not an end, but a pause. He'd walk again, he knew, when the time came, but for now he descended, the cracked shield on his back, the horn at his hip, a warrior unburdened yet whole. The tower's stair creaked under Torin's boots as he descended, the horn of Ver a steady weight against his hip, its bone and brass cool now, the runes a faint shimmer in the dim light. The wind followed him down, slipping through the cracks to tug at his cloak, carrying the last echoes of the horn's call, a sound that had shaken the Thornskull Range and stirred something deep within him, a fire he'd thought long extinguished. His cracked shield bumped against his back, its notches a silent tally of battles past, and the black stone in its pouch pulsed softly, a golden thread of warmth that anchored him to the present. The chamber below was empty, the traveler's amber light gone, their footsteps swallowed by the forest beyond. Torin stepped out into the clearing, the Glassvale River gleaming under a sky now ablaze with dusk streaks of amber and violet bleeding into the gray, the sun a molten disk sinking behind the western hills. The singing ash stood sentinel at the river's edge, its translucent leaves chiming in the breeze, their song a gentle farewell to the day. He paused, breathing in the crisp air, the scent of pine and glass mingling with the faint tang of his own sweat, and felt the weight of the road settle into a stillness he hadn't known in years. The horn's call lingered in his bones, Alric's voice a whisper of defiance and loss, and Torin understood its price, not memories, like the hollow shield, but a vow. To carry it was to accept the battles it might summon, not as a burden, but as a choice. He adjusted the horn on his shoulder, its runes catching the dying light, and turned eastward, back toward Stonewell. The traveler had their rivers of glass and songs of dusk. He'd find his own path, one step at a time, with a fire to warm his hands and a purpose to guide his feet. The journey back was quiet, the forest parting around him, the glass river's hum fading into the rustle of pine needles, and the distant cry of a hawk circling the peaks. Night fell as he reached the valley, the mist rising anew to cloak the hills, and Stonewell emerged from the haze, its chimneys trailing smoke into the stars. The bridge creaked under his weight, the river below a dark mirror reflecting the first glints of moonlight, and he crossed into the village, the inn's glow, a beacon in the gloom. The door swung open at his touch, the heat of the hearth washing over him, carrying the scent of fresh bread and roasted mutton. The innkeeper looked up from the counter, his flour-dusted hands pausing mid-wipe, and raised a bushy brow. "Back so soon, soldier?" he rumbled, eyeing the horn with a mix of curiosity and respect. "Thought you'd be halfway to the coast by now." Torin eased onto a bench, the cracked shield propped beside him, the horn resting across his lap. "Changed my mind," he said, his voice rough but lighter than it had been. "Got a fire here, and a bed. That's enough for tonight." He slid a copper across the table, the last from his pouch, and the innkeeper grunted, fetching a mug of ale and a plate piled with food. The room hummed with the village's rhythm laughter from a corner where farmers diced with wooden pegs, the clatter of a spoon as the girl swept the floor, the fire's steady crackle weaving through it all. Torin ate slowly, the mutton rich and warm, the ale washing away the dust of the road. He pulled the black stone from its pouch, setting it on the table beside the horn, its golden rune glowing faintly in the firelight. The innkeeper's words echoed, W-E-N work, strength or memory, and he wondered which it had given him, or if it mattered at all. The night deepened, the inn growing quiet as the villagers drifted home, their shadows flickering across the walls. Torin finished his meal, the plate scraped clean, and leaned back, the bench creaking under his armor. The fire burned low, its embers a soft red that painted the room in hues of warmth, and he traced the horn's runes with a scarred finger, feeling their hum beneath his touch. The hollow shield had taken his past, the horn of Vare had given him a voice, and the traveler had set him on the path where it led now was his to decide. He rose, the innkeeper nodding as he climbed the stairs to his cot, the horn and shield in hand. The room was as he'd left it, straw-strewn, the window rattling faintly, and he set his gear by the wall, the cracked shield catching the moonlight, the horn gleaming beside it. He lay down, the stone clutched in his fist, its warmth a steady pulse against his chest, and closed his eyes. The wind outside sang a soft lullaby. The village's heartbeat thrummed through the floor, and Torin slept, dreamless and deep, a warrior at rest with the road ahead, uncharted but his own. The Thornskull Range stood silent beyond the window, its peaks bathed in starlight, and the singing ash chimed faintly in the distance. A note carried on the breeze, a promise, or perhaps a memory, of a world that endured. Before we continue to the next chapter, please take 3 seconds to comment below. Let us know where you're from and what time it is where you live. Wishing everyone a joyful and wonderful day ahead, and a peaceful good night's sleep. Thank you all for joining us. Until the end of this story. Chapter 3. A Night at the Forest Inn. The fog hung low over the ancient forest, a soft, silvery veil, that draped itself over the gnarled branches and moss-clad stones. The night was still, save for the faint whisper of wind threading its way through the towering pines, their needles trembling ever so slightly in the cool, damp air. A single dirt path, worn smooth by countless unseen feet, wound deeper into the woods, its edges blurred by the mist. Along this path trudged a weary traveler, his cloak heavy with the dew of a long day's journey, his boots scuffing softly against the earth, the weight of his pack pressed into his shoulders, and his breath curled in faint wisps before him, mingling with the fog. He had walked for days, perhaps weeks, through valleys and over hills, chasing a quiet he could never quite name. Now, as the forest thickened around him, he felt the promise of rest tugging at his bones. Ahead, a faint golden glow pierced the haze, steady and warm, like a lantern held aloft by an unseen hand. The traveler paused, squinting through the mist. The light grew clearer, revealing the outline of a low, sturdy building nestled among the trees. Its sloping roof was blanketed in moss, and its walls, built of weathered timber, seemed to rise naturally from the forest floor, as though the woods themselves had shaped it over centuries. A curl of smoke drifted lazily from a stone chimney, blending with the fog, and the distant sound of crackling logs reached his ears. The Forest Inn, he thought, the name surfacing in his mind as if whispered by the wind itself. His legs, aching and leaden, carried him forward, drawn by the promise of shelter and warmth. The heavy oak door creaked as he pushed it open, its iron hinges groaning faintly in protest. A wave of comforting heat washed over him, carrying the mingled scents of aged wood, dried herbs, and something faintly sweet, perhaps, honey stirred into steaming tea. The inn's interior unfolded before him like a scene from a half-remembered dream. The floor was worn smooth by time, its planks darkened and polished by years of quiet footsteps. A broad hearth dominated the far wall, its fire burning evenly, the logs snapping and popping with a gentle rhythm that seemed to sync with the traveler's slowing heartbeat. The flames cast a golden glow across the room, painting flickering shadows on the rough-hewn beams overhead, and the hand-carved furniture scattered about tables smoothed by countless hands, chairs with backs curved like the bend of a river. Behind a low counter stood the innkeeper, a figure as timeless as the inn itself. His hair was a cascade of silver, flowing past his shoulders and catching the firelight like threads of moonlight. His face was lined with age, yet his eyes sparkled with a quiet wisdom, deep and knowing, as though he had listened to the forest's secrets for centuries. He wore a simple tunic of faded green, its edges frayed but clean, and his hands, gnarled yet steady, rested on the counter, fingers tracing the grain of the wood, as if greeting an old friend. "Welcome, traveler," he said, his voice a low, soothing hum that seemed to settle into the room like the warmth of the fire. "The forest has guided you here. Come, sit, rest." The traveler eased his pack to the floor, its thud muffled by a woven rug patterned with leaves and vines. He sank into a chair near the hearth, the wood creaking softly beneath him, and let out a long, slow breath. The fire's heat seeped into his chilled limbs, thawing the stiffness from his joints, while the innkeeper moved with unhurried grace to a small kettle hanging over the flames. The faint clink of a spoon against a clay mug followed, and soon a steaming cup was placed before the traveler. The tea smelled of chamomile and lavender, with a hint of something earthy, perhaps roots gathered from the forest floor. He wrapped his hands around the mug, its warmth spreading through his palms, and took a sip. The liquid was smooth and floral, easing the tightness in his chest with every swallow. "You've come a long way," the innkeeper said, settling into a chair across from him. His tone was gentle, an invitation rather than a question, and the traveler nodded, staring into the fire. The flames danced lazily, their amber tongues licking at the logs, and for a moment he saw shapes in their glow hills he'd crossed, rivers he'd forded, faces of those he'd met and left behind. "Aye," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse, "through the lowlands where the grasses sway like an ocean, and up the jagged spine of the mountains, where the wind howls like a beast, I've walked until my shadow grew thin." The innkeeper tilted his head, his silver hair catching the light. "The forest knows the weight of such journeys," he said. "It's seen many like you souls seeking something beyond the next rise. But tonight, it offers you stillness." He gestured toward the window, where the fog pressed against the glass, softening the world beyond into a dreamlike blur. The distant rustle of leaves carried faintly through the panes, a lullaby sung by the trees themselves. The traveler leaned back, the chair cradling him like an embrace. "I passed a village 3 days back," he said, his words spilling out slowly, as if unwinding from a spool. "A quiet place, tucked in a valley. The folk there were kind, offered me bread and a spot by their fire. Said the harvest had been good this year, that the rains came just when they needed. I listened to their laughter, watched the children chase each other through the fields. It was peaceful." He paused, sipping his tea, the steam curling around his face. "Before that, I crossed a bridge over a river so clear I could see the fish darting beneath. The water sang as it flowed, a sound that stayed with me for miles." The innkeeper smiled faintly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "The forest remembers those places too," he said. "Long ago, when these trees were saplings, a shepherd used to guide his flock through that valley. He'd sit by the river, playing a reed pipe, and the notes would drift up to these hills. The wind still carries echoes of it sometimes if you listen close." He leaned forward, stoking the fire with a poker, sending a flurry of sparks up the chimney. The logs shifted, settling deeper into the embers, and the crackle grew softer, a steady heartbeat in the quiet room. The traveler's gaze drifted to the walls, where shadows played across the wood, tracing knots and grooves worn smooth by time. A shelf above the hearth held a few treasures: a clay jug, a wooden flute, a small stone carved with runes. He couldn't read. Each seemed to belong here, as if the inn had gathered them over centuries, piece by piece. "This place feels old," he said, almost to himself, "like it's been waiting." "It has," the innkeeper replied, his voice a murmur. "The forest inn has stood since the first roots took hold in this earth. Travelers like you, merchants, minstrels, wanderers have passed through, leaving their stories in the air. The beams above us have heard tales of lost kingdoms, of stars that fell to light the rivers, of quiet nights like this one. It's a place for pausing, for breathing." The traveler nodded, his eyelids growing heavy. The tea warmed his belly, and the fire's glow bathed him in a golden haze. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees, a low, mournful sound that blended with the rustle of leaves and the occasional drip of dew from the eaves. He thought of the road behind him, the endless stretch of dirt and stone, the nights spent under a sky pricked with stars, the mornings when the sun rose slow and pink over the horizon. Each step had brought him here, to this moment where the world felt soft and still. "Tell me of the forest," he said, his voice a whisper. The innkeeper leaned back, his hands folding in his lap, and began to speak. "In the days when the moon was young," he said, "this wood was a sea of green, unbroken by paths or walls. Deer roamed beneath the canopy, their hooves silent on the moss, and streams wove through the roots like silver threads. The trees were tall even then, their branches reaching for the sky, and they whispered to one another in a language older than words. Folk came to listen, herbalists seeking roots, poets seeking dreams. They built this inn from fallen timber, blessed it with songs, and left it to stand as a haven." The traveler closed his eyes, letting the words wash over him. He could almost see it, the deer stepping lightly through the mist, the streams glinting in the moonlight, the poets with their quills and quiet smiles. The innkeeper's voice flowed on, steady and deep, weaving a tapestry of peace that wrapped around him like a blanket. There was a woman once, the innkeeper continued, who lived near the edge of the wood. She wove baskets from the reeds that grew by the water, and her hands were so deft, the birds would come to watch. She'd sit by her fire at night, humming tunes the wind carried away, and the forest kept her safe. The traveler's breathing slowed, matching the rhythm of the fire's crackle. He thought of his own journey, the weight of his pack, the ache in his legs, the moments of wonder that had kept him going. A field of wildflowers swaying in the breeze, their petals brushing his boots. A hawk, circling high above a canyon, its cry sharp against the silence. A night spent beneath an oak, its branches shielding him from the rain. Each memory drifted through him, soft and fleeting, as the innkeeper's voice blended with the sounds of the night, the wind, the leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. The fire burned low now, its embers glowing a deep, rich red. The innkeeper rose silently, fetching a quilt from a chest in the corner. It was patched and faded, stitched with patterns of acorns and ferns, and he draped it over the traveler's shoulders. The weight was gentle, grounding, and the scent of wool and lavender rose from its folds. "Rest now," the innkeeper murmured, his voice a thread in the quiet. "The forest will watch over you." The traveler sank deeper into the chair, the quilt soft against his skin. The inn seemed to breathe around him, its walls creaking faintly as if settling into the night. The fog outside thickened, pressing against the windows, and the world beyond faded into a hush. He could still hear the innkeeper's voice, low and steady, spinning tales of the forest's past, of a fox that danced in the moonlight, of a spring that bubbled up where a star once fell, of a time when the trees sang to the dawn. The words wove through his mind, gentle and unhurried, carrying him toward the edge of sleep. And there, in the glow of the dying fire, with the scent of tea lingering in the air and the forest whispering beyond the walls, the traveler let go. His thoughts drifted like leaves on a stream, carried away by the night, and the forest inn held him close, a timeless refuge in an endless wood. The traveler's breath grew soft and even, a faint rise and fall that matched the rhythm of the embers pulsing in the hearth. The quilt draped over him seemed to cocoon him in warmth, its faded threads brushing against his skin like the gentlest of breezes. The innkeeper lingered nearby, his silver hair aglow in the dim light, his presence a quiet anchor in the stillness. He moved with the grace of someone who had long ago learned the art of patience, tending to the fire with a care that suggested it was more ritual than task. A fresh log was eased onto the coals, and the flames stirred briefly, licking at the dry bark before settling into a steady, soothing crackle once more. The scent of pine resin bloomed in the air, sharp and sweet, mingling with the lingering notes of herbal tea. Beyond the thick panes of the window, the forest exhaled into the night. The fog had thickened into a silvery shroud, curling around the trunks of the ancient trees like a lover's embrace. The wind, now a mere sigh, wove through the branches, coaxing a faint rustle from the leaves, a sound so delicate. It seemed to hover just at the edge of hearing. Somewhere deep in the woods, a stream trickled over smooth stones, its voice a distant murmur that blended with the inn's own quiet chorus. The traveler, half dreaming, felt the forest's presence seep into him, as though its roots had threaded through the floorboards to cradle him where he sat. The innkeeper returned to his chair, easing into it with a soft creak of wood. His hands rested in his lap, fingers tracing the lines of his palms as if reading a map of years gone by. He gazed into the fire, its glow painting his face in hues of amber and shadow. And after a long, comfortable silence, he spoke again. "There was a time," he began, his voice a low hum that seemed to rise from the earth itself, "when the forest bloomed with flowers that glowed under the moon. Tiny petals, no bigger than a child's fingernail, shining like lanterns in the dark. Folk would come from far-off lands just to see them, to sit among their light and feel the night grow gentle around them." The traveler stirred faintly, his head tilting against the chair's high back, though his eyes remained closed. The innkeeper's words drifted into his mind like mist over a lake, painting pictures that shimmered behind his lids. He saw the flowers small and radiant, dotting the forest floor like scattered stars. He imagined their glow, soft and cool, illuminating the moss and ferns in a dance of light and shadow. The air would smell of dew and nectar, he thought, and the silence would be alive with the hum of unseen wings, moths, or fireflies, perhaps drawn to the blossom's quiet beauty. They called them moon bells, the innkeeper continued, his tone unhurried, each word falling like a drop of water into a still pool. Said they grew where the moonlight lingered longest, in clearings where the trees parted to let the sky breathe. An old healer once told me they could ease a troubled heart, just a petal steeped in water, sipped slow by the fire. I've not seen them myself, not in many years, but the forest holds their memory. Sometimes on nights like this, I think I catch their scent on the wind. The traveler's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, lost in the haze of sleep and story. He could almost taste the moonbell tea, sweet and subtle, a whisper of the forest's magic on his tongue. His mind wandered back to his own journey, to a night he'd spent in a meadow miles from here. The grass had been damp beneath him, the stars a canopy above, and he'd lain there listening to the cricket's song until the world felt vast and small all at once. That memory folded into the innkeeper's tale, blurring at the edges, and he wondered if moonbells had glowed nearby that night, unseen in the dark. The fire snapped softly, a log crumbling into ash, and the innkeeper leaned forward to nudge it with the poker. Sparks flared briefly, spiraling up the chimney like tiny lanterns of their own, and the room grew warmer still. The traveler's hands, resting loose around the now empty mug, twitched faintly as if reaching for something in a dream. The quilt slipped a little, pooling in his lap, and the innkeeper rose once more, his footsteps a hushed rhythm on the worn planks. He adjusted the blanket with care, tucking it gently around the traveler's shoulders, then paused to glance at the window. The fog had begun to thin, revealing glimpses of the trees beyond, tall and steadfast, their branches swaying like dancers in a slow, endless waltz. There was a stag, too, the innkeeper murmured, settling back into his seat, white as frost, with antlers that branched like the trees themselves. He roamed these woods in the days when the rivers ran deeper, when the rains fell soft and steady. The folk here said he was a guardian, a spirit of the forest's heart. They'd see him at dusk, standing still as stone, his coat catching the last light of day. Never hunted, never harmed, just watched, quiet as the shadows. I saw him once, long ago, through that very window. He looked at me and I felt the weight of the years he'd carried. The traveler's breathing deepened, a slow tide that rose and fell with the innkeeper's voice. He pictured the stag, its pale form glowing against the twilight, its eyes dark and endless, holding secrets older than the stones. He'd seen deer on his travels, fleeting shapes in the dawn mist, but none like this. The image lingered, serene and timeless, as the innkeeper's words wove on. Some say he still walks these paths, he said, on nights when the fog lies thick and the world grows still, a reminder that the forest endures, that it holds its own time. The wind outside shifted, a gentle gust that brushed the eaves and set the rafters creaking faintly overhead. The sound was a lullaby, blending with the fire's murmur and the distant trickle of the stream. The traveler sank deeper into the chair, his body heavy with the weight of rest, his mind rift with the echoes of the forest's tales. The quilt's warmth enveloped him, its patches of fern and acorn stitching a quiet pattern against his chest, and the scent of lavender lingered like a memory of spring. The innkeeper's voice, steady as the pulse of the embers, flowed on, threading through the stillness with the ease of a river finding its course. "There was a girl once," he said, his tone soft as the fog beyond the panes, "who loved the birds of this wood. She'd climb the tallest oaks, barefoot and fearless, to sit among their branches and listen to the dawn chorus. Wrens and sparrows, larks and thrushes they'd sing for her, or so the tale goes, filling the air with notes that danced like sunlight through the leaves." The traveler's mind, hovering at the edge of slumber, painted the scene in gentle hues. He saw the girl small and lithe, her hair a tangle of brown caught in the breeze, her laughter blending with the trills and warbles above. He imagined the bark rough beneath her hands, the sway of the tree as the wind moved through it, the sky peeking through the canopy in patches of pale gold. He'd heard birds on his own journey, blackbirds calling from hedgerows, a nightjar's churring in the dusk, and their songs had been a thread of comfort through the long miles. Now, in the innkeeper's words, they fluttered anew, their wings brushing the edges of his dreams. "She'd bring them gifts," the innkeeper continued, his voice a murmur that seemed to rise from the walls themselves. "Bits of bread, seeds she'd gathered from the meadows beyond the trees. In return, they'd perch on her shoulders, tiny feet light as whispers, and she'd name them Feather, Bright, Little Song." The forest folk said she understood their language, that she'd learned it from the wind and the rustle of the leaves. Even now, when the mornings break quiet, I think I hear her in the bird song, a note or two that doesn't quite belong to the rest. The fire glowed low, its light a soft caress across the room, gilding the edges of the hand-carved table and the worn arms of the chairs. The traveler's head lolled slightly, resting against the quilt, and his fingers curled loosely in his lap. The innkeeper paused, watching him with a faint, knowing smile, then rose to tend the hearth once more. The poker scraped gently against the stone, and a fresh log was nestled into the embers, coaxing a ripple of flame that cast new shadows on the weathered beams. The scent of burning wood sharpened for a moment, then softened, folding into the air like a sigh. Outside, the fog had lifted just enough to reveal the silhouettes of the trees, dark and graceful, their branches swaying in a rhythm older than memory. The wind had stilled, leaving only the faint drip of dew from the eaves, a steady patter that echoed the traveler's slowing pulse. He felt the forest breathing around him, its presence vast and gentle, a living thing that cradled the inn in its heart. The innkeeper settled back into his chair, his silver hair spilling over his shoulders like a river of moonlight, and his eyes drifted to the window, tracing the shapes beyond. There was a spring, too, he said, his voice weaving back into the quiet. Not far from here, hidden in a hollow where the ferns grow thick. Its water was cold and clear, tasting of stone and sky, and it bubbled up from the earth like a gift. Travelers would kneel by it, cup their hands, and drink deep, saying it washed the dust of the road from their souls. An old bard once sat there, strumming a lute with strings of silver, and he swore the spring sang back to him a melody so soft it could lull the stars to sleep. I've walked there myself, on nights when the moon hangs full, and the ripples catch its light like a mirror. The traveler's breath hitched faintly, a sigh lost in the haze of sleep, and he saw the spring, its surface glinting in the moonlight, the ferns bowing over it like guardians. He remembered a stream he'd crossed days ago, its water icy against his skin as he'd filled his flask, the sound of it gurgling over rocks a companion through the afternoon. The innkeeper's spring felt like kin to it, a quiet marvel tucked away in the world's folds, and he wondered if he'd passed it unknowingly on his way here, its song mingling with the wind. The quilt shifted as he sank deeper into the chair, its weight a gentle tether to the moment. The fire's crackle had softened to a whisper, the logs glowing red and gold, and the room seemed to hum with a stillness that wrapped around him like a shawl. The innkeeper's voice flowed on, a steady current beneath the silence. There was a time, he said, when the forest stretched unbroken to the sea. Its trees marched down to the cliffs, their roots tangling with the salt and stone, and the waves would crash below while the leaves shivered above. Fisherfolk would climb the paths to trade their catch for berries and wood, and they'd sit by fires like this one, telling tales of merfolk and storms. The forest listened, and it grew around their words, holding them close. The traveler's mind drifted to the coast he'd seen weeks before, gray waves rolling under a sky heavy with clouds, the scent of brine sharp in his nose. He'd stood on a bluff, watching gulls wheel overhead, their cries cutting through the roar of the sea, and felt the world stretch wide before him. Now, in the inn's embrace, that vastness softened, folding into the forest quiet, and he saw the trees reaching for the water, their branches swaying with the tide. The innkeeper's tale wove through his thoughts, seamless and slow, a thread that tied the road behind him to the night around him. The wind stirred faintly outside, brushing the window with a sigh, and the inn creaked in reply, its timbers settling deeper into the earth. The traveler's chest rose and fell, his breath a mirror to the forest's rhythm, and the quilt's warmth held him fast. The innkeeper leaned back, his hands resting still, and his voice dipped lower, a murmur that seemed to blend with the fire's glow. The forest keeps its stories, he said, in the roots and the leaves, in the stones and the streams. It whispers them to those who pause, who listen. And here, in this inn, they linger soft as the fog, steady as the trees. The traveler slept now, his face smooth in the firelight, his dreams a tapestry of all he'd seen and heard. The innkeeper watched him for a moment longer, then turned his gaze to the hearth, where the embers pulsed like a heartbeat. The night stretched on, timeless and gentle, and the forest inn stood as it always had, a haven in the wood, cradling its guest in the quiet of an endless, soothing tale. Before we continue to the next chapter, please take 3 seconds to comment below. Let us know where you're from and what time it is where you live. Wishing everyone a joyful and wonderful day ahead and a peaceful good night's sleep. Thank you all for joining us until the end of this story. Chapter 4. The Hearth in the Ancient Wood. The fog hung low over the ancient forest, a silvery veil that softened the edges of the world. It drifted between the towering pines, their needle-clad branches swaying faintly in the night's gentle breath, and curled around the roots that twisted through the mossy earth. The air carried a cool dampness, tinged with the earthy scent of bark and the fleeting sweetness of wildflowers tucked away in shadowed hollows. Somewhere far off, an owl's call drifted through the stillness, soft and mournful, as if welcoming the night to settle in. Through this quiet haze, a single figure trudged along a winding path, boots crunching faintly against the carpet of fallen leaves and twigs. The traveler's cloak, heavy with mist, clung to their shoulders, and their breath rose in faint plumes, mingling with the fog. Ahead, a warm light flickered through the trees, steady and golden, like a lantern held aloft by some unseen hand. As the traveler drew closer, the silhouette of a building emerged, a low, sturdy structure of weathered timber and stone, its slanted roof blanketed in a thick layer of moss. A sign swung gently above the door, its carved letters spelling out the Forest Inn in a script worn smooth by countless seasons. The glow spilled from narrow windows, their panes rippling with the imperfections of hand-blown glass. and a thin thread of smoke rose from a chimney, curling upward to join the misty sky. The sight of it felt like a sigh, a promise of rest after miles of endless road. The traveler paused at the threshold, one gloved hand resting on the iron latch. The door creaked open with a low groan, revealing a room bathed in the amber light of a crackling hearth. The fire danced lazily in its stone cradle, casting shifting shadows across walls of dark, aged wood. The beams overhead were thick and blackened by time, etched with faint carvings of curling vines and crescent moons, as if the forest itself had left its mark on the place. A scattering of tables stood about, their surfaces polished smooth by years of use, each adorned with a small clay vase, holding sprigs of dried lavender. The air inside was warm, carrying the rich scent of burning logs, laced with a subtle spice of simmering herbs. A faint draft brushed past as the door swung shut, stirring the heavy tapestry that hung near the hearth, a woven scene of deer grazing beneath a canopy of stars. At the far end of the room, behind a counter hewn from a single slab of oak, stood the innkeeper. He was a tall figure, his silver hair falling in loose waves to his shoulders, catching the firelight like threads of moonlight. His face was lined with the gentle creases of age, and his eyes, a deep hazel, held a quiet warmth that seemed to see beyond the surface of things. He wore a tunic of soft green wool, its hem embroidered with tiny leaves, and his hands moved with practiced ease as he polished a wooden mug with a cloth. When he spoke, his voice was low and resonant, a soothing rumble that seemed to blend with the crackle of the fire. "Welcome, traveler," he said, setting the mug aside. "The forest has brought you here tonight. Come sit. The hearth is warm, and there's tea brewing." The traveler nodded, too weary for words, and shrugged off their damp cloak, hanging it on a peg near the door. Their boots left faint prints on the worn floorboards as they crossed to a table near the fire. The chair, carved with simple, flowing lines, creaked softly as they sank into it, the tension of the road melting away with the heat that seeped into their bones. The innkeeper approached with a tray, setting down a steaming mug and a small plate of bread studded with seeds. The tea smelled of chamomile and mint, its steam curling upward in delicate tendrils, and the bread was still warm, its crust giving way to a soft, fragrant center. "Rest as long as you like," the innkeeper said, his tone unhurried. "The forest keeps its own time, and so do we." For a while, the traveler simply sat, letting the warmth of the mug seep into their hands. The fire snapped and popped, sending tiny sparks spiraling up the chimney, and outside, the wind whispered through the trees, a distant lullaby that wove through the silence. The golden light played across the room, glinting off a shelf of old books bound in leather, their spines cracked and faded. A lute rested in one corner, its strings catching the glow, and a basket of woolen blankets sat near the hearth, their edges frayed from use. Every detail seemed to breathe with age and care, as if the inn had grown from the forest itself, shaped by hands long gone but never forgotten. The innkeeper returned to his counter, humming a tune so soft it might have been the wind itself, and the traveler felt the weight of their journey settle into something softer, something easier to carry. "It's been a long road," they said at last, their voice rough from disuse. The innkeeper glanced over, his hands pausing on a loaf he was slicing. "Aye," he replied, "the forest sees many come and go. Each carries a tale. If you've one to share, I've ears to listen." The traveler took a sip of tea, the warmth spreading through their chest, and began to speak. "I've walked paths older than memory," they said, gazing into the fire. "Through valleys where the rivers sing, past stones carved with runes no one can read. The days blur together, sunlight filtering through leaves, the crunch of frost underfoot, the ache of miles in my legs. There was a village, once nestled in a hollow. Smoke rose from chimneys, and children laughed as they chased geese through the mud. I stayed a night, traded a few coppers for bread and a bed. The stars were bright there, sharper than I'd seen in weeks. The innkeeper nodded, his hands still as he listened, and the traveler continued, their words flowing like a slow river. Then came the hills, steep and silent, where the wind carried voices I couldn't place, whispers of old songs maybe, or the earth itself dreaming. I found a stream one morning, clear as glass, and watched fish dart beneath the surface, their scales flashing silver. It was peaceful, that moment. I sat there longer than I meant to, just listening to the water. They paused, tracing the grain of the table with a fingertip. The road brought me here, through fog so thick I could barely see my own hands, but the light your light cut through it. Felt like the forest wanted me to find this place. The innkeeper smiled, a faint curve that deepened the lines around his eyes. The forest has a way of guiding those who need it, he said. It's old, older than the stones, and it remembers. Long ago, they say it was a place of quiet magic, not the loud kind, with spells and thunder, but the soft kind, woven into the roots and the leaves. Travelers like you would come seeking rest, and the trees would listen. Some left gifts, carvings, songs, bits of thread tied to branches. You can still find them, if you know where to look. He crossed to the hearth, adding a log that sent a shower of sparks dancing upward. The fire flared briefly, then settled into a steady glow, painting the room in hues of amber and gold. There was a woman once, he went on, his voice a gentle thread in the tapestry of sound, a weaver with hair like the bark of a birch. She'd sit by that window there, spinning tales as she worked her loom. Said the forest told her stories of deer that danced under the moon, of streams that sang to the stars. She'd weave them into her cloth, and folks swore you could hear the tales if you held it close. She's long gone now, but the forest hasn't forgotten. The traveler leaned back, the chair creaking beneath them, and let the innkeeper's words drift over them like the mist outside. The fire's warmth pressed against their skin, and the tea's fragrance filled their senses, mingling with the faint musk of aged wood and the crispness of the night air seeping through the cracks. Outside, the wind sighed through the pines, a low, rhythmic hum that seemed to match the rise and fall of their breath. The inn felt alive in its stillness, a haven carved from time itself, and the traveler's eyelids grew heavy as the stories wove together their own. The innkeepers, the forests. Tell me more, they murmured, their voice soft as the shadows flickering on the wall. The innkeeper glanced over, his hazel eyes glinting with a quiet knowing, and began another tale of a shepherd who followed a glowing fox through the trees, of a night when the fog turned silver and the stars dipped low to listen. His words flowed like water over stones, smooth and unhurried, carrying the traveler deeper into the embrace of the night. The fire crackled, the wind whispered, and the forest inn held them both in its timeless arms, a sanctuary where the road could wait, just a little longer. The traveler's head tilted slightly, resting against the high back of the chair, as the innkeeper's voice wove its gentle spell. The firelight flickered across their face, softening the lines etched by wind and weariness, and the mug of tea sat half forgotten in their hands, its steam rising in lazy curls. The innkeeper's tale of the shepherd and the glowing fox faded into a comfortable pause, the silence filled only by the steady breath of the hearth and the distant murmur of the forest beyond the walls. The room seemed to settle deeper into itself, the shadows growing softer, the golden glow more tender, as if the inn were cradling them both in its ancient embrace. After a moment, the innkeeper rose, his movements slow and deliberate, and crossed to a small cupboard tucked beneath the counter. The wood groaned faintly as he opened it, revealing a collection of jars and tins, their labels faded to illegible scrawls. He selected one, a small clay pot sealed with a cork, and returned to the hearth, where a kettle hung over the flames, its surface blackened by years of use. "The forest gives more than shelter," he said, his voice a low hum as he pried the cork free. A faint, sweet aroma drifted out, like honey warmed by the sun, laced with the earthy tang of dried leaves. He tipped a pinch of the mixture into the kettle, and the water within hissed softly, releasing a plume of fragrance that mingled with the wood smoke. "This is from the glades, gathered under a full moon. It soothes the spirit, quiets the mind." The traveler watched through half-closed eyes as the innkeeper poured the brew into a fresh mug, the liquid catching the firelight in shades of amber and bronze. He set it before them, and the scent rose like a memory of meadows bathed in twilight, of dew-kissed grass bending under a gentle breeze. "Drink slow," he advised, settling into a chair across the table, his own hands empty, but his presence steady, grounding. "The forest has a way of speaking through these things, if you let it." The traveler lifted the mug, the warmth seeping into their palms, and took a tentative sip. The taste was soft, and layered sweetness folding into a faint bitterness, then easing into something green and alive, like the first breath of spring. It flowed down their throat, pooling in their chest, and they felt a quiet unraveling, a loosening of knots they hadn't known were there. "It's good," they murmured, the words slipping out like a sigh. The innkeeper's smile was a faint thing, barely a curve, but it carried the weight of years. "Aye," he said, "the forest knows what you need even when you don't." Outside, the fog pressed closer, its silvery tendrils brushing against the windows, blurring the line between the inn and the world beyond. The trees stood as sentinels, their branches swaying in a rhythm older than song, and the wind carried a faint rustle, like the turning of countless leaves in an endless dance. The traveler gazed out, the glass cool against their fingertips, and felt the vastness of it all, the forest stretching on forever, its roots threading through the earth, its canopy cradling the sky. "I saw a stag once," they said, their voice drifting into the stillness. "Days back, maybe weeks. It stood in a clearing, antlers like branches, eyes like pools of night. Didn't move, just watched me pass. Felt like it knew me." The innkeeper nodded, leaning forward slightly, the firelight catching the silver in his hair. "They do," he said. "The stags are old souls, keepers of the wood. They see more than we do, past and present, woven together. Folks say if one looks at you, it's a blessing, a mark of the forest's favor." He paused, his gaze drifting to the tapestry on the wall, where a stag's silhouette stood beneath a crescent moon. "There's a tale about a hunter who followed one too far. Not to kill, mind you, just to see where it led. Found a grove where the trees glowed soft as candles, and the air sang with voices he couldn't name. He came back changed, quieter, said he'd heard the heartbeat of the world." The traveler's eyes traced the woven threads, the stag's form seeming to shift in the flickering light, and they took another sip of the tea, letting the warmth settle deeper. "I believe it," they said. "This place, this forest, it feels alive, not loud, not angry, just here, like it's breathing with me." The innkeeper chuckled, a sound like stones tumbling in a stream. "That's the truth of it," he replied. "It's been here long before us, and it'll be here long after. We're just passing through, borrowing its peace for a night or two." The fire popped, sending a cascade of sparks upward, and the traveler sank further into the chair, the wood creaking softly beneath them. The innkeeper rose again, this time fetching a blanket from the basket near the hearth. It was thick and coarse, dyed a deep brown that matched the earth outside, and he draped it over the traveler's shoulders with a care that felt almost ceremonial. "Rest your eyes if you want," he said, his voice a steady thread in the quiet. "The night's long and the forest will keep watch." The traveler pulled the blanket closer, its weight a comfort against the lingering chill of the road, and let their gaze drift around the room once more. The carvings on the beam seemed to dance in the firelight, vines curling, moons waxing and waning, and the lute in the corner gleamed as if waiting for a hand to pluck its strings. The books on the shelf whispered of stories untold, their pages yellowed by time, and the lavender on the table released a faint floral breath with every shift of the air. It was a place out of time, a pocket of stillness where the world slowed to a heartbeat, and the traveler felt themselves slipping into its rhythm. "Another tale?" they asked, their voice barely above a whisper, and the innkeeper settled back into his chair, his hands resting loosely in his lap. "There was a girl," he began, his tone as soft as the wind outside, "who danced with the shadows. Not dark ones, mined shadows of leaves, cast by the moon. She'd twirl through the glades, barefoot, and the trees would sway with her, their branches bending low. Folks said she was half-spirit, born of the forest streams. One night she vanished, left only a trail of petals that glowed like stars. They say she's still out there, dancing when the moon is full." The words drifted over the traveler, mingling with the crackle of the fire and the sigh of the wind, and their eyelids fluttered, heavy with the weight of the night. The innkeeper's voice became a distant melody, threading through tales of wandering minstrels, of streams that carved secrets into the stone, of nights when the fog turned to silver and the world held its breath. The forest inn wrapped them in its glow, the hearth a steady pulse, the forest a quiet guardian, and the traveler drifted on the edge of sleep, carried by the timeless embrace of the ancient wood. The traveler's breath slowed, matching the gentle rise and fall of the fire's glow, as the innkeeper's voice continued to weave its quiet tapestry. The blanket across their shoulders felt like an anchor, grounding them in the warmth of the moment, and the mug of tea rested in their lap, its faint steam brushing against their chin. The inn seemed to hum with a life of its own, the soft groan of the floorboards, the murmur of the wind slipping through the eaves, the steady heartbeat of the hearth. Shadows danced lazily across the walls, stretching and shrinking with each flicker of the flames, and the air held a stillness that was both vast and intimate, like a secret shared between old friends. The innkeeper leaned back in his chair, his silver hair glinting as he tilted his head toward the ceiling, as if listening to the forest beyond. "There's a tree out there," he said, his voice a low current beneath the night's quiet, older than the rest. "They call it the Whispering Oak. Its trunk's wide as this room, gnarled and twisted, with roots that dive so deep they say they touch the bones of the earth. Folks used to sit beneath it, press their hands to its bark, and listen. Said it spoke in sighs soft words about the seasons, the rains, the lives that passed through its shade. I've heard it myself once or twice when the wind's just right." The traveler's eyes drifted half open, caught by the image of that ancient tree standing alone in the fog, its branches heavy with secrets. They shifted slightly, the blanket rustling, and murmured, "I'd like to see it." The innkeeper's gaze flicked to them, warm and knowing, and he nodded. "You might come morning," he said. "It's not far a stone's throw past the brook, where the mist hangs thickest. But it's patient. It'll wait for you." His words carried a promise, unhurried and sure, and the traveler let them settle like leaves falling to the forest floor. The fire snapped, a log crumbling into embers that pulsed with a deep rosy glow, and the innkeeper rose to tend it. He moved with the ease of ritual, selecting a piece of wood from a stack near the hearth-split pine, its grain pale and streaked with resin. As he placed it on the coals, a burst of fragrance filled the air, sharp and clean, like the breath of the trees after rain. The flames licked upward, curling around the new fuel, and the room brightened for a moment, casting light across the tapestry's threads, the lute's curves, the worn edges of the furniture. "Fire's a storyteller too," the innkeeper said, settling back into his seat. "It's been here as long as the forest, speaking in its own way. Crackles for joy, hisses for sorrow. Tonight, it's content, The traveler pulled the blanket tighter, the coarse wool brushing their neck, and let their gaze linger on the flames. The dance of orange and gold seemed to mirror the tales they'd heard of stags and shepherds, dancers and oaks, each spark a fleeting note in a song without end. "I walked through a storm once," they said, their voice soft, almost lost in the fire's rhythm. "Days ago, maybe more." The sky turned black, and the rain fell like arrows. Found a cave, just a hollow in the rock, and sat there while the thunder rolled. The water ran in sheets outside, but inside it was dry, cool, smelled of stone and moss. I slept there, I think, with the storm singing me to rest. The innkeeper tilted his head, his hands resting loosely on the table, and a faint smile touched his lips. "The forest gives shelter in its own way," he said. "That cave's one of its gifts. There are dozens like it, tucked away where the weary can find them. Long ago, a hermit lived in one, or so the tale goes. He carved pictures into the walls, birds, vines, the sun breaking through clouds. Folks still find them, worn but there, like echoes of his days." He paused, his eyes drifting to the window where the fog pressed close, silver and silent. "The storm you met, it's part of the forest too. Washes the leaves clean, fills the streams. It's fierce, but it's kind." The traveler nodded, the memory of that cave settling into the warmth of the inn, and took another sip of the tea, now cool but still fragrant. The taste lingered on their tongue, a quiet echo of the glades the innkeeper had spoken of, and they felt the edges of their thoughts soften, blurring into the night's embrace. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying a faint chorus of creaks and rustles, the trees swaying, the leaves whispering, the fog weaving through it all. It was a sound older than words, a lullaby born of the earth itself, and the traveler let it wash over them, steady and slow. The innkeeper rose again, this time crossing to the shelf of books. His fingers brushed the spines, tracing the cracked leather, and he pulled one free, a slim volume bound in faded blue, its edges soft from handling. He returned to the table, opening it with care, and the pages rustled like dry leaves, releasing a faint scent of dust and ink. "This one's old," he said, his voice a murmur, "written by a wanderer who stayed here, seasons past. She loved the forest, said it spoke to her in colors green for life, gold for memory, silver for dreams. She'd sit by that window watching the mist and write what she saw." He turned a page, revealing lines of slanted script adorned with tiny sketches of ferns and stars. "Here, the fog is a blanket, the trees its threads. I sleep beneath them, and the night is kind." The traveler leaned forward slightly, peering at the delicate words, and felt a kinship with that long-gone writer. "I've seen those colors," they said, their voice dreamy. "The green in the valleys, the gold when the sun hits the leaves just so. The silver's out there now, in the fog. It's like the forest is painting itself for me." The innkeeper closed the book gently, setting it aside, and his eyes crinkled with a quiet joy. "It does that," he said. "Shows itself to those who look. You got a wanderer's heart, same as she did." The fire settled lower, its light softening to a deep amber, and the room seemed to draw inward, cozy and close. The traveler sank deeper into the chair, the blanket a cocoon, and let their eyes drift shut. For a moment, the innkeeper's voice a steady thread pulling them along. "There was a boy once," he began anew, "who loved the brook beyond the inn. He'd sit there all day, tossing pebbles, watching the ripples spread. Said the water told him stories of fish that swam to the sea and back, of rains that fell 100 years ago. One summer he made a boat from twigs and set it sailing, watched it vanish around the bend, then ran inside, laughing, saying it was off to find the world." The tale drifted on, carried by the innkeeper's soothing cadence, and the traveler felt themselves slipping further, the line between waking and dreaming blurring like the fog outside. The inn held them, its wooden walls, its glowing hearth, its timeless air, and the forest breathed around it, vast and gentle. The wind sang through the pines. The fire whispered its contentment, and the traveler floated on the edge of sleep, wrapped in the endless embrace of the night. The traveler's head rested fully against the chair now, the wood worn smooth by countless others who had sat there before, its curves cradling them like a gentle hand. The blanket draped over their shoulders had settled into a familiar weight, its fibers catching the faint scent of the hearth smoke and the herbal tea that lingered in the air. The fire burned low, a bed of embers glowing beneath a thin shroud of ash, casting a soft, rosy light that pulsed faintly, like the heartbeat of the inn itself. The room was a cocoon of warmth and shadow, the golden edges softened by the night, and the wind outside wove its endless song through the trees, a melody that seemed to seep into the walls and hum beneath the floorboards. The innkeeper's chair creaked as he shifted, his silver hair falling across his brow as he gazed into the embers. His hands rested on the table, fingers tracing the deep grooves carved by time, and his voice emerged like a thread of smoke, curling through the stillness. "There's a glade not far from here," he said, his tone as soft as the rustle of leaves. "Hidden, unless you know the way. The trees part there, and the ground dips into a bowl of moss, green as emeralds even in winter. At its center sits a stone flat, wide, smooth as glass. No one knows who put it there, but it's warm to the touch. Always, even when frost rims the branches. They say it's a resting place, a gift from the forest to those who've walked too long." The traveler's eyes fluttered open for a moment, drawn by the image of that mossy hollow, the stone glowing faintly in their mind's eye. "Sounds like a dream," they murmured, their voice barely a breath, and the innkeeper nodded, his hazel eyes glinting with the fire's reflection. It might be," he said. "I've sat there myself, on nights when the moon hangs low. The air's still, and the moss cushions you like a bed. You can hear the forest breathing slow, deep, like it's alive beneath you. Once, I saw fireflies, dozens of them, drifting up from the stone. They floated there, winking like stars come down to rest." The traveler let the words paint the scene, the glade unfolding in their thoughts, a quiet sanctuary tucked within the endless sprawl of trees. They shifted slightly, the blanket rustling, and the embers flared as a draft slipped through the room, stirring the tapestry's edges. "I passed a place like that, maybe," they said, their voice drifting like the fireflies in the tale. "A dip in the earth, days back. The air felt different there, thicker, sweeter. I didn't stop long, but I remember the quiet. No birds, no wind, just peace, like the world held its breath." The innkeeper's smile was a faint curve, etched with understanding. "That's the forest's way," he said. "It leaves markers, little pockets of itself for those who need them. You felt it, even if you didn't know." He rose, crossing to the hearth with a slow, measured step, and knelt to nudge the embers with a poker. The coals shifted, releasing a soft hiss and a scattering of sparks that spiraled upward, and the room warmed anew, the light brushing the edges of the carved beams overhead. "There's another tale about that stone," he went on, his voice blending with the fire's murmur. "A healer found it long ago. She'd lost her way, wandering after a storm, her satchel empty of herbs, sat there to rest, and when she woke, the moss was thick with plants feverfew, yarrow, things she hadn't seen for miles. Said the forest gave them to her, a thank you for her care." The traveler's fingers curled around the mug, the tea long since cooled but still fragrant, and they took a slow sip, letting the taste anchor them to the moment. The innkeeper's words flowed like a stream, smooth and unhurried, carrying them deeper into the night. Outside, the fog thickened, its silver tendrils pressing against the windows, and the trees seemed to lean closer, their branches tracing patterns against the glass. The wind sighed through the pines, a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the inn, and the traveler felt it in their chest, a rhythm as old as the earth itself. "I met a woman once," they said, their voice soft and distant, "on a bridge over a river. Wood creaked underfoot, slick with moss. She was old, bent like a willow, with a basket of roots on her arm. Didn't speak, just smiled and pointed downstream. I followed the water after that, found a ford where the stones were flat, easy to cross. Don't know why I trusted her, but it felt right." They paused, tracing the memory, the sound of the river bubbling up through the haze of days. Her eyes were green, bright, like the forest was looking through her. The innkeeper settled back into his chair, the poker resting across his knees, and his gaze softened. "That'd be Mara, maybe," he said. "She's been seen here and there, always near water. Folks call her the root keeper, say she tends the forest's edges, gathers what's needed. Never stays long, but she leaves a mark, a smile, a path, a handful of berries by the wayside. She's part of it, like the stags, the streams." He leaned forward slightly, the firelight catching the lines of his face. "You've crossed paths with more of this place than most, traveler. It's woven itself into your steps." The traveler's eyelids grew heavy again, the weight of the blanket and the warmth of the room pulling them downward. But they clung to the innkeeper's voice, a lifeline in the tide of sleep. The inn seemed to expand and contract with each breath, the walls creaking faintly, the hearth glowing steady, the air thick with the scent of pine and herbs. The lute in the corner gleamed, its strings untouched but alive with possibility, and the books on the shelf whispered of tales yet unread, their pages curling with age. Every corner of the room held a story, a fragment of the forest's vast memory, and the traveler felt themselves sinking into it, a thread in its endless weave. "Tell me of the wind," they murmured, their voice a wisp, and the innkeeper tilted his head, listening to the faint howl that slipped through the cracks. "The wind's a wanderer too," he said, his tone a caress against the night. "It's carried songs from the mountains, secrets from the sea. Here, it dances with the trees, brushes the leaves until they sing. There was a man once, a flute maker, who swore he could hear it speak. He'd sit on his porch, carving reeds, and play what he heard, notes that drifted like mist, soft and fleeting. Folks said his music could calm a storm, call the birds down from the sky. One night, he walked into the forest with his flute and never came back. But sometimes when the wind's high, you'll hear it a tune. No one taught the trees." The traveler smiled faintly, the image of that flute's melody threading through the pines, and let their eyes drift shut. The innkeeper's voice flowed on, a river of tales of a fox that led lost children home, of a spring that bubbled only under starlight, of nights when the fog turned gold and the forest dreamed aloud. The fire crackled, the wind sang, and the forest inn held them both, a timeless haven where the road faded into shadow, and the night stretched on, endless and kind. The traveler's breath had softened to a whisper, a gentle rhythm that matched the rise and fall of the embers in the hearth. The blanket lay heavy across their shoulders, its edges brushing their wrists, and the chair beneath them creaked faintly, as if settling into the night alongside them. The innkeeper's voice drifted through the room, a steady current beneath the quiet chorus of the forest, the wind's low hum, the distant rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig beneath some unseen creature's step. The firelight painted the walls in hues of amber and rose, softening the carved beams overhead into a dreamlike haze, and the air held the mingled scents of pine, herbs, and the faint musk of aged wood, a fragrance that seemed to seep into the traveler's bones. The innkeeper sat with his hands folded, his silver hair catching the glow as he gazed toward the window, where the fog pressed close, silver and silent. "There's a path out there," he said, his voice a murmur, slow and deliberate, that winds past the whispering oak, and deeper still. It's narrow, barely more than a deer trail, lined with ferns that glow faintly when the moon's full. Follow it long enough, and you'll find a pond still as a mirror, ringed by willows. The water's so clear you can see the stars reflected, even on a cloudy night. Folks say it's a place of echoes, whisper a wish, and the forest keeps it, holds it close until the time's right. The travelers' lips parted slightly, a breath escaping as they pictured the pond, its surface a glassy pool beneath drooping branches, the stars winking back from its depths. "I'd whisper for rest," they said, their voice faint, woven with the drowsiness that tugged at their edges. "Not just tonight, but always. A rest that stays." The innkeeper's eyes crinkled, a warmth flickering there, and he nodded. "A good wish," he said. "The forest listens to those. It's held wishes older than this inn, dreams of wanderers, hopes of the lost. That pond's a keeper of them all." The fire dwindled lower, its light a soft blush across the room, and the innkeeper rose, his movements unhurried, as if time itself had slowed to match the night. He crossed to the hearth, adding a single log small, its bark peeling in curls and the flames licked upward, a gentle flare that sent shadows swaying across the tapestry. The deer woven there seemed to shift, their heads lifting as if to listen, and the traveler's gaze followed the motion, their thoughts drifting like leaves on a stream. "I saw a fox," they murmured, the memory rising unbidden, red as the fire, days back. "It crossed my path, stopped, looked at me. Then it was gone, like smoke. Felt like it was leading me somewhere." The innkeeper settled back into his chair, the poker resting beside him, and his voice took on a quieter tone, a thread winding toward something deeper. "Foxes know the ways," he said. "They're guides, in their own fashion. There's a tale of one, a vixen with eyes like embers who led a girl to a hollow tree. Inside was a cache of honey, left by some forgotten bear, and the girl brought it home, fed her kin through a hard winter. The fox watched her go, then slipped away. They're fleeting, but they leave gifts, if you're lucky." He paused, his gaze drifting to the window again, where the fog seemed to pulse faintly, alive with the night's breath. "Yours might have been leading you here." The traveler's fingers tightened briefly on the blanket, the wool coarse against their skin, and they let the thought settle. The fox, the path, the inn, all pieces of a journey they hadn't named. The tea in their mug was cold now, but they lifted it anyway, the faint taste of honey and mint a quiet echo of the forest's gifts. Outside, the wind sighed through the pines, a sound that seemed to wrap around the inn, cradling it in the vastness of the wood. The trees stood as sentinels, their branches swaying in a dance older than memory, and the traveler felt the weight of it all the miles behind them, the stillness before them melting into the warmth of the moment. The innkeeper leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table, and his voice grew softer still, a whisper against the night. "There was a time," he said, "when the forest sang louder, not with sound, but with light. The moss would gleam, the streams would shimmer, and the air itself felt alive, like it held a heartbeat. Travelers would come, drawn by it, and sit beneath the trees, listening to nothing and everything. One of them, a poet, with ink-stained hands, wrote that the forest was a cradle, rocking the world to sleep. He stayed here a season, left verses scratched into the beams. Look up, and you'll see them still." The traveler's eyes drifted upward, tracing the faint carving's words too worn to read, but alive with intent, and they felt a quiet pull, a connection to that poet, to all who had passed through this place. The innkeeper's voice flowed on, a river nearing its end, and the room seemed to hush, the fire's crackle fading to a gentle sigh. "The forest hasn't changed," he said. "It's still that cradle, still that light. You've walked its paths, felt its breath. It's carried you here to this night, this chair, and it'll carry you on when you're ready, not with haste, but with care." The traveler's eyelids fluttered, heavy with the weight of the words, and they sank deeper into the chair, the blanket a cocoon, the inn a sanctuary. The fire glowed soft and steady, its embers a constellation of warmth, and the wind outside wove its final notes, a lullaby that threaded through the silence. The innkeeper's voice grew fainter, a murmur on the edge of dreams. "Rest now," he said, his tone a benediction. "The forest knows your name, your steps. It's woven you into its tale, a thread among many, but yours alone. Sleep, and let it hold you. The night's not done, but it's yours to keep." The traveler's breath evened out, a slow tide that matched the forest's pulse, and the inn settled around them, timeless and still. The fire burned low, a quiet witness to the night, and the fog outside shimmered faintly, as if the stars themselves had slipped down to listen. The forest inn stood firm, its walls a testament to countless journeys, its hearth a promise of peace. And there, in the heart of the ancient wood, the traveler drifted into sleep, not an end, but a pause, a moment of perfect rest held in the forest's embrace, where the world was vast and gentle, and the night stretched on, meaningful and whole. Before we continue to the next chapter, please take 3 seconds to comment below. Let us know where you're from and what time it is where you live. Wishing everyone a joyful and wonderful day ahead and a peaceful good night's sleep. Thank you all for joining us until the end of this story.